Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The map sits on my kitchen table like an accusation. Red ink circles a structure that shouldn't exist. A cabin marked on a surveyor's chart from 1987, nestled in a fold of Sierra Nevada terrain I've walked a dozen times without ever seeing anything but pine and granite. The paper smells like basement mold and forgotten things. I've been staring at it for 3 days now, ever since I found it in the county archives, filed under a case number that led me down a rabbit hole I'm not sure I can climb out of. My hand keeps drifting to the radio on my belt. The same radio. I should have turned it in after that rescue 2 weeks ago. Should have let the department decommission it like protocol demands after equipment malfunctions. But I didn't, because I need to know if the voice will come back. I was 32 years old and thought I'd seen everything the mountains could throw at volunteers like me. 8 years of search and rescue teaches you about exposure, hypothermia, broken ankles on talus slopes, the particular way granite smells right before a storm. It doesn't prepare you for the impossible. The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon. 7-year-old wandered off from a family camping trip on the Meadow Creek Trail. Standard difficulty, well-marked path, good weather. The kind of rescue that usually ends with a scared youngster found within 2 hours, sitting by a stream waiting for adults to stop being angry. I took the northwest quadrant, the section that climbed toward the ridgeline through dense Jeffrey pine and manzanita. Solo search, radio check every 15 minutes, standard operating procedure. The static started 20 minutes into my ascent. At first, I thought it was interference from the granite outcrops. The radio hissed and popped, swallowing half of dispatch's words. I adjusted the squelch, checked the battery connection, kept moving through undergrowth that scratched at my cargo pants. The trail markers appeared at regular intervals, weathered wooden posts with yellow blazes, the reassuring geometry of human planning imposed on wilderness chaos. Then I heard my name. Not my call sign, not Rescue 4, or my last name preceded by Officer. My first name, the one my mother chose, spoken in a voice that sounded like it was coming through water, through static, through something thicker than air. The voice said it again, and this time I stopped walking. My boots ground against loose shale. Pine needles fell somewhere to my left with a sound like whispered secrets. The voice was young, pre-adolescent, with that particular quality children's voices have before they deepen. Androgynous, clear, impossible to place as boy, or not quite yet man. It shouldn't have known my name. The volunteer roster used last names only. The dispatch logs, the equipment checkout sheets, the coordination boards at base camp. All last names, all protocol, all designed to maintain professional distance between rescuers and the chaos of emergency. The voice told me to leave the trail. I want to say I hesitated. I want to say I questioned the decision, called it in, waited for confirmation. But the truth is darker than that. The truth is that something in that voice felt like gravity, like inevitability, like the moment before you fall when your body knows it's already too late to catch yourself. My feet moved before my brain fully processed the command, stepping off the marked path into virgin forest where no yellow blazes guided the way. The radio crackled with that voice at irregular intervals, giving me directions that made no cartographic sense. Northeast when the topography suggested southwest. Uphill when logic demanded down. I climbed over deadfall that looked untouched by human passage, pushed through manzanita thickets that should have been impassable, followed coordinates that existed only in that child's voice transmitted through frequencies that shouldn't carry sound at all. The forest changed as I went deeper. The light took on a quality I'd never seen before in the Sierras. Not the golden warmth of afternoon sun through pine canopy, but something greener, older, filtered through layers of atmosphere that bent differently here. The bird sounds stopped. The insect drone faded. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. I found the clearing after 40 minutes of deviating from protocol. A rough circle of bare earth surrounded by pines so densely packed they seemed to lean inward, creating walls of bark and needle. In the center sat a small backpack, bright blue nylon, cartoon characters I didn't recognize faded by weather and time. Next to it, pressed into soft dirt, were boot prints, adult-sized. The tread pattern was clear, crisp, recent. They led away from the backpack toward the thicker forest, then stopped as abruptly as if their owner had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. My hand shook as I keyed the radio to report the find. I gave coordinates, described the scene, used the clinical language we're trained to employ when discoveries might become evidence. Dispatch acknowledged receipt, asked me to hold position. Standard procedure when search items are located outside expected parameters. Then the voice came back. It said 4 words that I hear in my sleep now, that echo in the space between heartbeats. Don't look behind you. The temperature dropped. I felt it through my jacket, through the thermal layer underneath, through skin and muscle down to bone marrow. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the presence of something fundamentally wrong with reality. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, that ancient primate warning system activating, the hindbrain screaming danger in frequencies older than language. I heard breathing, close, directly behind me. Shallow, rapid, the respiration of someone trying to stay quiet but failing, because fear does things to human bodies that can't be controlled. Adult breathing, not the quick little huffs of a young one. Deep chest capacity, male pattern, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck even though the air was completely still. Every instinct I possessed demanded I turn around. The human need to see threats, to put eyes on danger, to transform the unknown into the known, even if the knowledge destroys you. It pulled at my spine like fishhooks. But the voice had been right about everything else. The deviation from the trail, the clearing, the evidence that something had happened here that the official search grids would never have found. So I didn't turn. I stood frozen, staring at those boot prints that led nowhere, listening to breathing that couldn't be real, feeling watched by eyes I refused to meet. Seconds stretched into geology. My pulse thundered in my ears, competing with that shallow breathing, creating a rhythm that felt like it was trying to tell me something in a language I'd lost the ability to understand. The radio crackled once more. Different voice this time. Dispatch, clean and professional, telling me another team had found the missing youngster half a mile south, dehydrated but unharmed. They were bringing him down. Search was concluding. All volunteers should return to base camp. The breathing behind me stopped. The temperature returned to normal so quickly I felt dizzy. When I finally turned around, breaking protocol, breaking the promise I'd made to that impossible voice, nothing was there. Just trees and shadow and the ordinary geometry of wilderness that didn't explain anything at all. I hiked back to base camp in a fugue state, my brain trying to process what hadn't happened, what couldn't have happened, what absolutely had happened regardless of what physics and reason and sanity suggested. The little one they'd found couldn't remember wandering off, couldn't explain how he'd traveled so far from the marked trail. Just kept saying he'd followed a voice that told him where to go until he got too tired to walk. I submitted my report without mentioning the voice, without mentioning the clearing or the backpack or the boot prints, or the thing that had breathed behind me. Official records show, Volunteer Rescue 4 conducted standard grid search of assigned quadrant, 0 findings. Search concluded by alternate team. Clean, professional, bureaucratically perfect. That night, back in my apartment 3 hours from the mountains, I listened to the radio recording. We're required to keep our units on continuous record during active searches. Liability protection, evidence documentation, quality control. I plugged my unit into my laptop and opened the audio file, expecting static and dispatch calls, and my own voice reporting coordinates. What I got instead was 90 minutes of normal search sounds. My footsteps, my breathing, dispatch communications. And then, exactly at the moment I'd entered that clearing, a whisper under the static. I had to amplify it, filter out interference, listen 17 times before I could make out the words. He got me first. The voice was the same one that had guided me off the trail, the same pre-adolescent tone. But in this recording, stripped of radio distortion, it carried weight I hadn't heard during the search. Resignation. Finality. The acoustic signature of something that had already ended, but somehow kept speaking anyway. I spent 3 days researching missing persons databases, old newspaper archives, the dusty filing cabinets in the county sheriff's basement where they keep cases that never got solved. Found him on the 4th day of searching. Missing persons bulletin from August 1994. A young one from Fresno. Vanished during a family camping trip in the same general area of Sierra Nevada where I'd conducted my search. Last seen on Meadow Creek Trail. Never found. Case went cold after 6 months. Parents moved away. Forest Service installed new trail markers the following summer. Life continued. The name in the bulletin was the same name I'd heard in the static. Now the map sits on my table and I have to make a choice that feels less like decision and more like destiny. The cabin marked in red shouldn't exist. I've walked that area repeatedly, know every ridge and drainage, every game trail and granite face. But the surveyor's notation is clear. Unoccupied structure, possible squatter activity, recommend follow-up. The date places it 2 years before the disappearance. The coordinates place it directly west of the clearing where I found the backpack. I've been touching the radio compulsively, turning it on at random times, waiting for static to resolve into that voice again, asking questions I don't want answered. If I go back to the cabin, what will I find? Evidence of crimes that law enforcement should handle? Proof of supernatural intervention that would make me sound insane if I reported it? Or just more emptiness, more questions, more confirmation that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved by people who still pretend reality follows rules? The rational part of my brain lists reasons not to go. I'm not law enforcement. I have no authority to investigate. The area is remote, dangerous, outside any search grid. I should pass this information to proper channels and let them handle it. But the other part of my brain, the part that heard my name in the static, that felt breathing on my neck, that knows those boot prints led somewhere even if they appeared to lead nowhere, that part understands something essential about this situation. Some rescues aren't about saving people who are still alive. Some rescues are about finding what was lost so completely that even disappearance becomes a kind of permanence. I've started packing. Medical kit, GPS, water purification tablets, the radio, extra batteries, topographic maps with the cabin coordinates marked. I'm not telling dispatch where I'm going. This isn't an official search. This is something else entirely. A reckoning, maybe, or a completion, or possibly the beginning of becoming lost myself in ways that have nothing to do with geographic position. The radio sits on top of my pack, silent. But sometimes in the space between thoughts, I think I hear static, and underneath the static something waiting, something that knows my name and where I'm going, and what I'll find when I get there. I'll leave at dawn. The drive takes 3 hours, the hike another 2 to reach the coordinates. I should arrive at the cabin site around midday, when the sun is highest and shadows are shortest and the world pretends to be explicable. I should be afraid, part of me is. But there's another feeling too, one I can't quite name. It feels like obligation or debt, or the sense that I've been called to witness something that was always meant to be seen by eyes like mine. Eyes that looked at evidence and chose belief over comfort, that heard impossible voices and followed them anyway. The map is folded now, tucked into my jacket pocket over my heart. The cabin coordinates are memorized. The radio is charged and waiting. Whatever I find in those ruins, or whatever finds me, I'll document it, record it, try to understand it, even if understanding means accepting that the mountains hold more than granite and timber, that search and rescue sometimes means recovering things that can't be measured by breathing and heartbeat. I don't know if I'll come back, but I know I have to go. Some rescues, I'm learning, are measured in questions rather than answers, in the willingness to walk into uncertainty rather than the ability to extract yourself from it. The voice in the static called me by name for a reason, and I'm either crazy enough or sane enough to believe that reason matters more than safety. Dawn is 3 hours away. I should sleep. Instead, I sit at my kitchen table with the radio next to my hand, listening to silence that isn't quite silent, waiting for static that might tell me I'm making the right choice, or might just be the sound of my own fear processed through electronics that shouldn't be able to carry meaning at all. The mountains are waiting. The cabin is waiting. Something that knew my name 30 years before I ever walked those trails is waiting. And in the morning, I'll stop waiting too. Story 2. In the salt flats stretch white and infinite under a moon so bright it hurts to look at directly. I've been living in this converted Sprinter van for 3 months now, ever since I liquidated everything. The apartment in Portland, the furniture, the life I'd built over a decade of pretending stability mattered. The American dream reduced to 170 square feet of rolling metal and the promise of absolute freedom. Except freedom, I'm learning, has a way of feeling like exposure. Bonneville salt flats at night are a different world. During the day, tourists pull off I-80 to take pictures of the crystalline expanse, that impossible flatness where land and sky blur into abstraction. But after sunset, when the last RV rumbles back toward civilization, the flats become something else entirely, something older. The silence here isn't peaceful, it's aggressive, pressing against your eardrums like deep water. Every sound you make feels like an intrusion, an offense against the vast emptiness that existed long before you and will persist long after. I'd parked in a pullout near the old salt processing facility, a cluster of abandoned structures slowly being reclaimed by the mineral landscape. The nearest working gas station sat 30 miles east. No cell signal, no lights except my own. Just the moon and the salt and the knowledge that I was utterly, completely alone. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. The night it started, I'd been asleep maybe 2 hours when the sound woke me. 3 knocks against the van's exterior, deliberate and spaced. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. The kind of rhythm that could only be intentional. My heart kicked into overdrive before my brain fully caught up, that primal response bypassing conscious thought. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, phone clutched in one hand even though it was useless out here, and listened. Silence stretched for maybe 15 seconds. Then the knocks came again, but from the passenger side now. The same pattern, the same measured pace. Someone, or something, was circling my van. I forced myself to move, crawling toward the driver's seat where I'd installed a small monitor connected to my rear-facing backup camera. The screen showed nothing but salt and moonlight at first. Then, at the edge of the frame, movement. A shape, low to the ground, impossibly elongated. It moved wrong, too fluid, joints bending at angles that made my stomach clench. The shape dragged something behind it, leaving a dark trail scored through the white salt. The knock came again, right behind my head this time. The metal shell of the van vibrated with the impact. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, twisting them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and simultaneously, impossibly, the radio clicked on. I know I'd turned it off hours earlier. I always do, compulsive about preserving the battery. But there it was, suddenly live, tuned to static between stations. Except it wasn't quite static. Underneath the white noise, I could hear voices. Multiple voices, speaking rapidly in reverse, the words tumbling backward in a stream of glossolalia that raised every hair on my arms. I didn't wait to understand. I slammed the van into drive and floored it, fishtailing across the salt until I found the road. In my rearview mirror, something stood where my van had been, a vertical shadow against the horizontal world. Before the distance swallowed it, the truck stop materialized like a mirage, fluorescent lights cutting through the darkness. I pulled into the lot breathing hard, hands cramped from gripping the wheel. Inside, a woman in her 50s stood behind the counter, her name tag identifying her simply as employee. Her eyes tracked me as I entered, and something in her expression suggested this wasn't the first time someone had stumbled in from the flats looking haunted. I asked if anything strange happened out there, trying to sound casual and failing completely. She studied me for a long moment before speaking. The runners sometimes come back from the lake, she said, after they get lost in the mirages. They don't realize they're gone yet, so they keep searching for what they were chasing. I asked what lake. Bonneville salt flats are what remains after an ancient lake evaporated. She just shook her head and recommended I keep driving. Don't stop until I hit Wendover. But I didn't. I couldn't, because doubt had already started its corrosive work. Had I really seen something, or had exhaustion and isolation manufactured a threat from shadows and my own paranoia? The rational part of my brain, the part that still remembered my former life of schedules and certainty, insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe teenagers, maybe wildlife, maybe a particularly vivid nightmare bleeding into waking consciousness. So at dawn, I drove back. The salt glowed pink and gold in the early light. I found my parking spot easily. The tire tracks were still visible, twin dark lines cutting across the white. And there, all around where the van had sat, were footprints. Dozens of them. All barefoot, the toes spread wide like they'd been sprinting. But the pattern made no sense. Every footprint pointed toward where the van had been. Not a single one pointed away. They circled the space completely, a ring of frozen approach with no retreat, as if something had surrounded me from all directions and then simply vanished when I fled. Or as if something was still there, in the same position, waiting for me to return. I spent that day in a diner 40 miles away, drinking coffee that tasted like rust and trying to convince myself to keep driving. West to California, east back to civilization, south to anywhere with people and noise and the comfortable anonymity of crowds. But the question had hooked itself into my brain. What had I actually seen? What would happen if I went back prepared, armed with evidence-gathering equipment, and the determination to document whatever was out there? The idea felt insane and necessary in equal measure. I'd come out here seeking something. Freedom, meaning, escape from a life that had felt like slow suffocation. Maybe this was it. Maybe I'd stumbled into the story I'd been unconsciously seeking, the experience that would justify all the bridges I'd burned to get here. By evening, I'd convinced myself, one more night, one more test. But this time, I'd be ready. I bought 50 pounds of rock salt from a hardware store, the kind people use for water softeners. At an electronics outlet, I found a USB microphone designed for field recording, capable of capturing sounds in a 360-degree radius. The clerk asked what I was recording. I told him ambient noise for a podcast. He looked doubtful but took my money. The sun was setting when I returned to the same spot. The footprints were gone, erased by wind or time or something else. I worked quickly, pouring the rock salt in a perfect circle around where I'd parked the van, a barrier drawn in crystalline white against the existing white. It felt ridiculous and vital, like performing a ritual I only half believed in. The microphone I mounted on the van's roof, connected via cable to a laptop inside. If something came tonight, I'd hear it. I'd have proof. Full darkness came fast. The moon rose, turning everything ghost pale. I sat in the driver's seat, laptop balanced on the center console, watching the audio levels remain flat. Nothing but wind, the occasional tick of cooling metal, my own breathing, which sounded too loud in the enclosed space. 3:12 a.m., according to the dashboard clock, the same time as last night. The knock came, 3 times, spaced evenly. The same pattern, same deliberate pace. My eyes snapped to the laptop screen, watching the waveform spike with each impact. The microphone was catching it, which meant it was real, actually happening, not some auditory hallucination born from isolation. Then, on the audio feed, I heard something else. A sound like fabric dragging across rough stone, though there was no stone here, only salt. And underneath that, a wet rhythmic noise. Breathing, movement. The microphone couldn't determine direction, just captured everything in an omnidirectional wash. I pulled up the rear camera feed. Empty salt flats, moonlight. My shadow cast long against the white ground. Then, at the very edge of the frame, movement. But this time I could see it clearly, and clearly was worse than ambiguity. It had limbs. I could count at least 6, but they bent wrong, folding in on themselves and extending in ways that shouldn't be anatomically possible. The body was elongated, stretched like taffy, and it moved with a horrifying efficiency, pulling itself forward with those too many limbs while something dragged behind it. A tail? A shed skin? I couldn't tell. The thing moved through my salt circle without pause, the barrier I'd drawn meaningless against it. The knock came again, directly above my head this time. On the roof. Something was on the roof. The metal groaned under shifting weight. I watched the ceiling dimple slightly, just a centimeter, as if something heavy was redistributing its mass. The audio feed captured a new sound, a snuffling, investigating noise, like a dog searching for a scent, but wetter, more organic. My hand found the key in the ignition. Every instinct screamed to start the engine, to run like I'd run before. But something stopped me. If I ran now, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering. I'd never know what I'd seen, what had circled my van in the dark, what those footprints meant. The question would eat me alive more surely than whatever was on my roof. So I waited. The snuffling continued. The weight shifted again, moving toward the rear of the van. On the laptop, the waveform spiked suddenly, a sound like clicking, rapid and insectile. Then a voice. "Lost," it said. Not from the speakers, not from outside. The word formed in my head, fully realized, as if someone had spoken directly into my thoughts. The voice wasn't male or female, wasn't quite human. It had texture like rust and salt and old bone. "Lost," it repeated. "Looking, running, can't stop, have to find it. The lake. Where did it go?" My throat had closed completely. I couldn't have responded if I'd wanted to. The thing, I couldn't think of it as anything else, moved again, and I heard the wet dragging sound as it pulled itself off the roof and down the side of the van. The camera showed it briefly, that elongated form pressing against the passenger window, leaving a smear of something dark and viscous on the glass. Then it was gone. The audio levels dropped to baseline. Wind. Silence. My own ragged breathing. I sat there for an hour, maybe more, waiting for it to come back. But the night remained empty, or appeared to. Eventually, exhaustion won over adrenaline, and I slept sitting up, head against the window, laptop still recording. Dawn woke me. Pink light flooding the salt. I checked the recordings first. 3 hours of audio, all backed up to my hard drive. The knocks were there, the dragging sounds, the clicking, but the voice, I couldn't find it. When it had said lost, the waveform showed only ambient noise, as if the words had existed in a frequency the microphone couldn't capture, or as if they'd never been spoken aloud at all. I forced myself outside. The salt circle I'd poured was intact, unbroken, but inside it, surrounding the van, were more footprints. Hundreds of them now, layered over each other, all pointing inward. Some were normal-sized. Others were elongated, the toes stretched impossibly long. A few weren't quite feet at all, more like handprints, or paw prints, or something in between. And there, on the passenger window, was the smear. I touched it carefully. It felt like salt, like dried sweat, like nothing at all. When I tried to wipe it away, my hand came back clean, but the mark remained. I'm writing this from the van still parked in the same spot. It's been 3 days. The footprints haven't increased, but they haven't faded either. At night, I hear the knocking, always at 3:12 a.m., always 3 times, always circling. I've stopped running. Where would I go? Whatever this is, whatever I saw or hallucinated or invited through some combination of isolation and desperation, it's here now. It's found me. Or maybe I found it. The woman at the truck stop was wrong about one thing. They aren't coming back from the lake. They never left. They're still running, still searching for water that evaporated millennia ago, trapped in an eternal pursuit of something that no longer exists. And I'm starting to understand why they circle my van, why they press against the windows and knock on the doors. They think I'm the lake. They think I'm what they've been looking for. They think if they can just get inside, they'll finally be able to stop running, to rest, to remember what they were before the thirst drove them mad. Sometimes late at night when the knocking starts, I find myself reaching for the door handle. Not to run, but to let them in. Because the question that's eating me alive isn't what they are, or whether they're real. It's whether I'm any different. Whether I'm not also running from something that doesn't exist anymore, circling endlessly around an emptiness I've mistaken for meaning. The moon's rising again. It'll be 3:12 in a few hours. I've started looking forward to it, to that moment of certainty when the knocking proves I'm not alone, that something else exists in this white void besides me and my doubt. I keep the camera running, the microphone recording, documenting everything for... what? Who? I was supposed to be free out here. Instead, I'm more trapped than I've ever been, circling the same square footage of salt, waiting for something that might never come, or might have never left. The footprints are at my door again. I can see them through the windshield, fresh prints appearing in the salt as I watch, moving toward the van in that same pattern. All approach, no retreat. Getting closer. Always closer. My hand is on the door handle. Maybe tonight, I'll finally understand. Maybe tonight I'll stop running too. Story 3. The dam shouldn't have been that quiet. My brother and I arrived at Fontana Dam just after noon, the autumn sun doing little to cut through the cold that seemed to rise from the reservoir itself. The visitor center stood locked, windows dark, a handwritten sign taped to the door announcing unexpected closure. No explanation, no date of return, just the word closed in hurried capital letters, the ink smudged as though written in a rush. We'd driven 4 hours from Knoxville for this. The old TVA dam had been on our list since spring, one of those plans you make when someone tells you that you need to spend more time together, that family matters, that you never know how much time you have. The irony wasn't lost on me, standing there in front of that locked door, feeling the weight of wasted miles. My brother suggested we walk the dam anyway, make something of the trip. The October air carried that particular mountain sharpness, the kind that makes you aware of every breath entering your lungs. We started across the concrete span, our footsteps echoing against the massive wall that held back Fontana Lake. And that's when I noticed the railings. Every 20 feet or so, crude signs had been fixed to the metal handrails with electrical tape. Black tape on silver metal, forming the same word repeated over and over. Listen. Not danger or caution or any of the official warnings you'd expect on a structure like this. Just listen, spelled out in hasty letters, the tape already peeling at the edges, flapping slightly in the wind that swept across the dam's face. My brother stopped at the first one, touched the tape with his index finger. The adhesive left a gray residue on his skin. He wiped it on his jeans and kept walking, but I could see the way his shoulders had tensed, the way his eyes kept tracking to the next sign, and the next. I tried to listen. The wind moved through the surrounding peaks with a low moan. Water lapped somewhere far below us against the dam's base or the rocky shore. A bird called from the forest behind the visitor center, sharp, insistent, 3 times in succession. But nothing else, nothing that would warrant this strange, repeated instruction. We crossed the entire span in silence, our breath forming brief clouds in the cold air. The far side offered a hiking trail that wound down toward the river, the Little Tennessee feeding into the reservoir. The path looked recently maintained, cleared of fallen branches, marked with fresh paint blazes on the trees. We descended without discussing it, both of us perhaps wanting to put distance between ourselves and those unsettling signs. The trail opened onto a stretch of riverbank where the water ran wide and shallow over smooth stones. The sound should have been pleasant, that constant rushing murmur of current over rock. Instead, it seemed too loud, overwhelming, as though trying to drown out something else. I found myself straining to hear beyond it, to catch whatever lay underneath. That's when I saw her. An older woman sat on a flat boulder at the water's edge, maybe 50 yards downstream. She wore a red jacket, the color bright against the gray stones and dark water. Her position seemed precarious, the rock surrounded by deeper current, but she sat perfectly still, facing the river. As we approached along the trail, I could hear her voice, soft, melodic, carrying over the water's noise in a way that shouldn't have been possible. She was singing, Not words, just a melody, rising and falling in a pattern that felt almost familiar, like something you'd heard once in a dream and spent years trying to remember. The tune had no clear beginning or end, just continuous phrases that flowed into each other, cycling back on themselves. My brother stopped walking. He'd heard it too. We stood there on the trail, listening to this stranger's wordless song, and I felt the hair on my arms stand up beneath my jacket. The melody carried something in it. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of longing, or maybe warning. I couldn't tell which. She must have sensed us watching because she stopped mid-phrase and turned. Her face looked ordinary enough, weathered by sun and wind, the kind you'd see on any hiker or local in these mountains. But her eyes held mine with an intensity that made me want to look away and couldn't. She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew something small and dark. A piece of slate, the kind you'd find all through these mountains, broken off from some larger formation. She held it up so we could see, then took out what looked like a piece of chalk and began marking on the stone surface with deliberate strokes. Even from that distance, I could read what she wrote. Listen. She held the slate toward us for a long moment, her eyes never leaving mine. Then she set it carefully on the boulder beside her, stood with surprising grace, and stepped into the current. The water came up to her knees, but she waded through it without hesitation, reaching the far bank and disappearing into the tree line without looking back. My brother spoke for the first time since we'd left the dam, his voice barely above a whisper. He asked if I'd seen what she'd written. I told him yes. He asked what it meant. I said I didn't know, but I was lying. Something in that repeated word, in the way she'd looked at me while writing it, felt like an instruction specifically meant for me, though I couldn't explain why. We hiked back to the car in silence, the woman's melody circling through my head, and drove to the campground we'd reserved near Cades Cove. The site sat isolated at the end of a gravel loop, surrounded by second-growth forest, the kind of spot that seems perfect until the sun goes down, and you realize how far you are from anyone else. We set up the tent as shadows lengthened between the trees, strung a bear bag, started a small fire. Normal camping routines, but I kept catching myself pausing mid-task, listening to the woods around us. Birdsong faded with the light, insects quieted. By the time full darkness fell, the forest had gone completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. No rustle of leaves, no crack of branch, no scurry of nocturnal animals beginning their night rounds. Even the wind had died, leaving the air perfectly still. I'd been camping in these mountains before, and I'd never experienced silence like this. Nature is never truly quiet. There's always some sound, some movement, some proof of life continuing in the dark. My brother fed another stick to the fire, the snap of burning wood obscenely loud in that stillness. He suggested we turn in early, get a good night's sleep before tomorrow's hike. I agreed because I didn't want to sit there anymore, straining my ears against that oppressive quiet, waiting for something to break it. Inside the tent, we lay in our sleeping bags, the only illumination coming from the dying fire outside, casting shifting shadows on the nylon walls. I could hear my brother's breathing, too loud, too present. Could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could hear nothing else. Then the whistling started. It came from behind the tent, where the forest pressed close. The same melody the woman had been singing by the river, but rendered in pure tone, each note precise and clear, cutting through the silence like something sharp. Not quite human, not quite not. Too controlled to be wind through branches, too organic to be mechanical. I felt my brother go rigid beside me. The whistling continued, cycling through that familiar-unfamiliar pattern, neither approaching nor retreating. Just there, constant, patient, as though it could continue all night and into every night after. My hand found my phone in the dark. I opened the voice recorder app and held the device toward the tent wall, toward that sound. The recording icon pulsed red as the whistling went on, phrase after phrase, the melody somehow both beautiful and deeply wrong. After maybe 10 minutes, it stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, pressing against the tent fabric. We lay there for hours, neither of us sleeping, neither of us speaking, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. Morning came gray and cold, mist rising from the ground in thick streamers. My brother suggested we pack up and leave, forget the hiking plans, just go home. But I was already pulling up the recording from my phone, listening to it with headphones while he broke down the tent. The first few seconds were just ambient sound, the rustle of the sleeping bag, my breathing. Then the whistling began, clear and undistorted. But as I listened, focusing on the pattern rather than the melody, I started to hear something else. The notes weren't random. They rose and fell in two regular intervals, the long tones and short ones creating a rhythm that tickled something in my memory from high school, from learning about wartime communication. Morse code. I pulled up a translation app, played the recording again, marking down each long whistle as a dash, each short one as a dot. The pattern resolved into numbers, coordinates, latitude and longitude, precise to several decimal points, indicating a location somewhere in the park. I showed my brother. He stared at the numbers on my phone screen, then at me, and said we should leave now. That whatever this was, we didn't need to be part of it. But I was already pulling up the mapping app, dropping a pin at those coordinates. The location sat about 3 miles away, at an overlook above Fontana Lake. A place called Observation Point, accessible by a steep trail that branched off from the main road. I don't know why I insisted we go. Maybe because that woman's eyes had held mine with such desperate intensity. Maybe because the signs on the dam railing felt like they'd been left specifically for people like us to find. Maybe because I needed to understand why someone would spend a night whistling coordinates in code outside our tent, in a forest that had gone silent for them. We drove to the trailhead as dawn burned off the mist. The parking area stood empty, the trail unmarked on most maps, more of a local secret than a tourist destination. We climbed in silence, our boots finding purchase on rocks still slick with dew, our breathing loud in our own ears. The trail emerged onto a rocky outcrop 40 minutes later. Observation Point jutted out over the lake, offering a view of the dam in the distance, the vast expanse of reservoir stretching away toward the horizon. The morning sun caught the water, turning it silver and blinding. But I wasn't looking at the view. Someone had been here recently. The dirt near the outcrop's edge showed disturbance, marks where something had been dragged toward the drop. Boot prints, deep and panicked, the tread pattern clear in the mud. They led right to the edge and stopped, and I didn't want to look over, didn't want to see what might be floating in that water far below. But I made myself approach. Nothing. Just water, rocks, the shoreline far below, empty. My brother called out from behind me, his voice strange. He'd found something wedged between two rocks, hidden unless you knew where to look. A portable cassette recorder, the kind that hadn't been common since the 90s. Its plastic case cracked, batteries corroded, the tape inside visible through the clear window. I took it from him with shaking hands. The recorder wouldn't play. Too much damage, too much time exposed to weather. But I could see writing on the tape's label, faded but legible. Listen. And then I heard it, faint, rising from the lake itself, from the water far below, or the dam in the distance, or from the hills surrounding us on every side. That melody. Not whistled this time, but carried on wind or water or something else. The same wordless tune the woman had sung, cycling through its phrases, beautiful and terrible. My brother heard it too. I could see it in his face, the way the color drained from his skin, the way his eyes went wide and searching. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing no louder but more insistent, more present, filling the air around us until there was nothing else. The drag marks in the dirt, the broken recorder, the coordinates whistled in the dark, the signs on the railing, that woman on the rock, holding up her slate, her eyes locked on mine. Listen. Someone wanted us to hear. Someone had wanted everyone to hear. And they'd stood in this exact spot, I realized with sudden horrible certainty, recording that lake's sound, trying to capture whatever it was that the water held, trying to preserve it, trying to warn. The melody stopped. The silence that followed felt worse, expectant, as though the lake itself was waiting for something, waiting for us to understand, waiting for us to respond. We didn't speak on the hike down, didn't speak during the drive home. My brother dropped me at my apartment and left without coming inside, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his goodbye clipped and final in a way that suggested he didn't want to discuss what we'd heard, what we'd found, what any of it meant. That was 3 weeks ago. I've been back twice since then. Driven down alone, hiked up to observation point, stood at the edge and listened. Each time, the lake sings. Always the same melody, rising from its depths or echoing from its shores, cycling through those familiar phrases. Sometimes I can hear it even when I'm not there, lying in bed at night, listening to the silence of my apartment and hearing underneath it that constant, patient tune. I've researched the dam's history. Before Fontana Lake was flooded in 1944, several small communities existed in the valleys that now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water. Towns with names like Proctor and Judson and Hazel Creek, with homes and schools and churches, all evacuated and abandoned before the reservoir filled. The government promised relocation assistance, promised fair compensation, promised to move the cemeteries. They kept most of those promises. Most. I found references to unexplained incidents during the filling, workers reporting sounds from the rising water, a foreman who climbed to the dam's peak and stood there for hours, just listening, before walking back down and resigning without explanation. A surveyor who disappeared in 1945, last seen near what's now Observation Point, carrying recording equipment. The woman by the river wasn't in any of the photos I've found from that era, and she'd been too young anyway, too present. But her eyes had held the same look I've seen in those old photographs, the evacuees watching their homes disappear beneath the water, their faces etched with something beyond simple loss. I don't know who she was or is, don't know who made those signs or who whistled coordinates outside our tent. Don't know if the recorder at Observation Point had been there for days or decades. Don't know what lies under Fontana Lake's surface, what it might be trying to say through current and wave and wind. But I know I can hear it now, everywhere, in running water, in rustling leaves, in the white noise of traffic and the hum of electricity and the sound of my own blood moving through my veins. That melody, cycling endlessly, patient and insistent, waiting for something I'm almost ready to give. My brother won't return my calls. The last message he left said he'd been hearing it too, that he'd tried to listen to other things, drown it out with music or podcasts or conversation, but the melody always finds its way through. He said he was thinking about going back to the dam, to Observation Point, just one more time, just to see if understanding would make it stop. That was 2 days ago. I haven't heard from him since. I'm parked at the trailhead now, writing this on my phone, watching the sun set over the mountains. The forest around me is going quiet, that same oppressive silence we experienced weeks ago. Soon the whistling will start, rising from the trees or the lake below or from inside my own head. I can't tell anymore which. I have my own recorder now. Fresh batteries, new tape. I'm going to climb to Observation Point in the dark, stand where those drag marks led, and listen to what the lake wants to tell me. Really listen this time, the way those signs commanded, the way that woman pleaded with her eyes, the way whoever left that broken recorder tried before me. Maybe I'll understand then. Maybe the melody will finally make sense, resolve into something I can process instead of this maddening loop that plays behind every thought, every breath, every moment of silence. Or maybe I'll just be adding my own boots to the mud at the edge, my own recordings to those already hidden in the rocks, my own signs to the railing. Listen, listen, listen. Hoping that someone eventually will hear what we're all trying so desperately to say. The sun's gone now. The forest is silent. In the distance I can hear it starting. That patient, eternal melody rising from the dark water of Fontana Lake. It's time to listen. Story 4. 3 months had passed since that night in the Wyoming highlands, but the sound of those overlapping voices still crawled through my sleep like insects beneath skin. My friends, Theo with his geology degree and rational explanations for everything, and Dixon, who'd grown up hunting these same planes. Both refused to go back. They'd listened to the recording exactly once before deleting their copies, insisting we'd somehow captured radio interference, though neither could explain why a ham operator would broadcast nursery rhyme cadences in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning. I kept my copy, played it backward and forward until the words lost all meaning, became pure phonetic texture. The reversed phrase was unmistakable. Don't open the door. But what door? The tent flap? Something else entirely? The question became a splinter working deeper into my thoughts with each passing day. Now I stood at the trailhead again, October wind cutting across the plateau with the kind of cold that found every gap in your clothing. The aspen groves had turned gold and rust, their leaves chattering in a frequency that made my jaw tense. I'd told myself this trip was about closure, about proving there was a logical explanation. But as I shouldered my pack and checked the new trail recorder clipped to my belt, this one with better microphones, longer battery life, I knew I was lying. I wanted to hear them again, wanted to understand. The hike took most of the day. The landscape here existed in a perpetual state of in-between, too high for dense forest, too low for true alpine exposure. Scrub brush and stunted pines clung to rocky soil, and everywhere the grass moved in waves that suggested vast, invisible herds. I'd studied the topographical maps obsessively, memorized every contour line. The spot where we'd camped sat in a shallow depression, a natural amphitheater of land that provided shelter from the worst winds. I reached it as the sun hemorrhaged across the western horizon, painting the clouds in shades of arterial red. The fire ring we'd built remained, stones blackened but otherwise undisturbed. No evidence anyone else had been here in the intervening months. I walked the perimeter slowly, running my GPS coordinates against the saved waypoints, confirming this was exactly the right place. The silence felt deliberate, not peaceful, deliberate, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. I set up my tent on the same spot we'd used before, the nylon walls snapping taut in the gusting wind. Every movement felt observed, though when I scanned the surrounding terrain I saw nothing but grass and stone, and the first stars punching through the darkening vault above. The recorder on my belt clicked softly as it captured ambient sound, its red LED pulsing like a tiny heartbeat. By the time I'd arranged my sleeping bag and unpacked my supplies, full darkness had settled over the highlands. No moon. The stars provided just enough light to navigate by, but they also created shadows, deep pools of black between the scattered pines that seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking directly at them. I built a small fire, more for the psychological comfort than warmth, and ate a cold meal while watching the flames throw flickering orange light across the grass. The wind had died completely, leaving a stillness so profound I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. That was when I noticed my breathing had synchronized with something else, a distant rhythmic sound like bellows working slowly. I held my breath. The sound continued, stopped when I exhaled, resumed when I inhaled again. Just the wind finding some gap in the rocks, I told myself. Acoustic phenomena were common in these geological formations. Theo would have launched into an explanation about resonance frequencies and harmonic amplification, but Theo wasn't here, and the rational part of my mind that usually housed his voice felt very far away. I retreated into the tent around 9, leaving the fire to burn itself out. The recorder stayed on, clipped to the tent's center support, its microphones oriented toward the entrance. I lay in my sleeping bag fully clothed, staring at the nylon ceiling while my eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness. Outside, something, probably an owl or nighthawk, called in a series of descending notes that sounded almost like laughter. Sleep came in fragments, shallow dips into unconsciousness broken by the tent fabric's random pops and snaps as temperature differentials stressed the material. Each time I surfaced, I checked my watch. 11, midnight, 1:15, 2:40. At 3:07, I heard the first syllable. It came from the direction of the tent's entrance, but also somehow from beneath me, as if the sound originated from inside the earth itself. Not a word, just a soft exhalation shaped into something approximating human phonemes. I lay frozen, every muscle locked, feeling my heartbeat accelerate until it seemed my chest would split open. Another sound followed, then another. They built upon each other like a round, voices stacking in discordant harmony. The words, if they were words, remained just outside comprehension, syllables that suggested meaning without quite achieving it. The quality reminded me of listening to conversations in a language you almost recognized, where your brain kept insisting it should understand but couldn't quite bridge the gap. I forced myself to reach for the tent zipper, my hand moving through darkness thick as water. My fingers found the metal pole just as the sound changed. All those layered voices suddenly coalescing into synchronization, speaking in perfect unison. Leave the door. The childlike cadence hit me like cold water. Exactly as it had sounded on the recording, that lilting nursery rhyme quality that made the words feel both innocent and deeply wrong. I froze with my hand on the zipper, not pulling, not releasing. The voices continued, repeating the phrase with mechanical precision, each iteration identical to the last. Leave the door, leave the door, leave the door. Then, cutting through the chorus, came that single deep inhalation, the sound of something massive filling its lungs before a dive. I'd heard it before, that night 3 months ago, and hearing it again made my bladder clench and my vision blur at the edges. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. I stayed motionless, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The recorder continued its soft clicking, red LED painting the tent's interior in rhythmic pulses. Eventually, I have no idea how long, I lowered myself back into my sleeping bag, pulling it up to my chin like a frightened animal seeking den safety. I didn't sleep. I watched the tent ceiling slowly lighten from black to gray to pale blue as dawn approached, and I listened to nothing but wind and my own terrified breathing. Morning arrived with startling normalcy. Sunlight flooded the highlands, turning the grass into waves of silver and green. I emerged from the tent on shaking legs, my muscles stiff from hours of tension, and conducted the same search we'd done before. The ground around the tent showed only my own footprints, the impression of my boots crisp in the frost-hardened soil. No other tracks, no disturbances, nothing. But the recorder had captured something. When I played back the file, I heard my own movement inside the tent, heard the moment my hand found the zipper, and then, crystal clear, those overlapping voices. Leave the door. I played it backward. The reversed phrase was different this time. Rot dead evil. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the device. I played it again, forward and backward, trying to convince myself I'd misheard. But the words remained consistent. Leave the door became rot dead evil when reversed. I spent the rest of the morning in a kind of fugue state, packing my gear with mechanical efficiency while my thoughts spiraled. The recorder had captured proof. Proof of what? Voices in the night, phonemes that formed coherent phrases depending on playback direction. But proof of what exactly? I should have left then. Should have hiked back to the trailhead, driven home, accepted that some mysteries couldn't be solved. Instead, I found myself studying the terrain with new attention, looking for the door they kept mentioning. A door in the landscape, a cave entrance, something that would make the warning make sense. The geological formation to the east caught my eye, a jumble of weathered boulders creating gaps and shadows. Nothing I'd noticed before, but then we hadn't explored much beyond our campsite on that first trip. I approached slowly, the recorder running on my belt, documenting everything. The gaps between the boulders did create something like an entrance, a narrow space where darkness pooled despite the morning sun. I knelt at the opening, peering inside. The smell that wafted out made me recoil. Not rot exactly, but something ancient and mineral, like the breath of deep caves. My hand found my flashlight without conscious decision. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a space larger than it appeared from outside. The boulders formed a rough chamber, maybe 8 feet deep, the floor covered in fine dust that showed no tracks. But on the back wall, someone had carved symbols, not words, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, shapes that seemed to shift and reconfigure when observed peripherally. They'd been etched deep into the rock, and their edges had weathered smooth, suggesting great age. I backed out of the space quickly, my pulse hammering. The recorder's LED had gone dark. Dead battery, despite being fully charged that morning. I fumbled for my phone to take photos, but its screen showed only static, horizontal lines of corrupted pixels that formed and reformed into patterns that almost resembled the carved symbols. Don't open the door. The reversed message suddenly made terrible sense. There was no physical door here. The door was attention, investigation, the act of looking too closely at something that should remain ignored. And I'd thrown it wide open. The rest of that day remains fragmented in memory. I know I hiked back to the trailhead, though I have no clear recollection of the journey itself. My truck's dashboard clock showed 7 hours had passed when it should have taken 4. I'd lost time somewhere, though whether through dissociation or something else, I couldn't say. The drive home took on dreamlike qualities. Every other vehicle on the highway seemed to be following at the exact same distance, maintaining perfect spacing. Radio stations phased in and out, and occasionally I'd catch fragments of that childlike voice between frequencies, speaking syllables that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I'd planned to analyze the recordings when I got home, to enhance the audio, and try to understand what I'd actually heard. But when I connected the recorder to my computer, the files were gone, not corrupted, simply absent. The device's memory showed empty, as if I'd never recorded anything at all. My phone's photos had also vanished, leaving only that video of static that now ran for 47 minutes despite me recording for less than 1. I watched it once, trying to find patterns in the noise, but the longer I stared, the more convinced I became that the static was actually thousands of tiny mouths opening and closing in synchronization. I deleted it, or tried to. The file kept reappearing, and eventually I just stopped looking at my phone altogether. That was 4 days ago. Since then, I've started noticing things. The way shadows pool in the corners of my apartment, even with all the lights on. How my reflection in mirrors seems to lag slightly behind my actual movements. The sensation of breath on the back of my neck when I'm alone. And the voices, always at 3 in the morning, always with that childlike cadence, whispering from the spaces between walls. Leave the door. I've tried to convince myself it's trauma response, that my brain is manufacturing patterns from nothing, because it needs an explanation for what happened up there. Theo would say stress and isolation triggered some kind of psychotic break. Dixon would probably recommend I talk to someone at his church, but neither of them have been answering my calls lately. When I drove past Theo's apartment yesterday, I saw him watching me from his window. But when our eyes met, he drew the curtains closed with that same synchronized precision I'd noticed in the highway traffic. The worst part is the dreams. Every night I'm back in that tent, hand on the zipper, and the voices are saying something different. You brought it home. When I play the dreams backward in my memory, and yes, I understand how insane that sounds, they say, home to guide you. I've started sleeping during the day, when sunlight makes the shadows behave normally. But even in the brightness, I sometimes catch movement at the edges of my vision. Shapes that dissolve into nothing when I turn to look directly. They're learning, these shapes. Learning to move the way I expect them to move, to exist in the gaps of my perception. Whatever was trying to warn me in Wyoming wasn't trying to keep me out. It was trying to keep itself in. And I, in my arrogance and curiosity, had spent 2 nights inviting it to speak, teaching it the rhythms and patterns of human language, showing it the pathway from that stone chamber to here. The door they kept mentioning wasn't something I needed to physically open. It was attention, awareness, the conscious act of acknowledging their existence. And now, having opened it, I don't know how to close it again. I'm writing this down because I need to document what's happening while my thoughts are still coherent, still recognizably mine. Already I can feel something changing in the way I process language, the way words form in my mind before emerging as speech. Sometimes I catch myself about to say things in reverse, syllables assembling backward before I consciously correct them. The recorder I bought for the second trip is sitting on my desk, its LED glowing steady red despite no batteries, despite the power switch being in the off position. I've been watching it for the past hour, and I swear the red light is starting to pulse in rhythm with something. Not my heartbeat, but something else, something deeper and slower and infinitely patient. I think they're still trying to warn me. Or maybe they're trying to teach me. The distinction feels less clear with each passing hour. All I know for certain is this. There are things in the high places that exist in the margins between sounds, in the spaces where language fails. They've been there far longer than we have, and they have been waiting with the patience of stone for someone to finally learn their language. I just wish I hadn't been the one to start the conversation. 3 days after writing this, the apartment management found my door standing open at 3 in the morning, all lights on, but no sign of me inside. A single recording device sat on the kitchen table, battery dead, memory empty except for one file. 47 minutes of overlapping voices, all saying the same phrase in childlike cadence. When played backward, they say, "He finally understands." Story 5. The river doesn't forget. That's what I've come to understand in the 20 years since it tried to keep me. I was 11 when the sandy bottom gave way beneath my feet. One moment I was standing in the shallows of the Merrimack, feeling the current tug at my calves like playful hands. And the next I was being pulled sideways through darkness that tasted of rot and mineral. My shoulders scraped against something massive and submerged. A fallen tree, I learned later. And then the water was forcing itself into my lungs, filling me with a coldness that went deeper than temperature. When I surfaced 20 yards downstream, I couldn't remember the journey between points. Just the pressure, the darkness, and the sensation that something had guided me through passages that shouldn't exist. My father pulled me out, slapped my back until I vomited river water onto the rocks, and never took me back to that stretch. He died without explaining why, and I spent 2 decades trying to convince myself it had been an ordinary accident, a freak undertow, a child's panic making monsters of hydraulics. But here I am again, standing on the same bank where memory bleeds into nightmare, and the river is exactly as I remembered it, which is to say it's nothing like it should be. The invitation came 3 weeks ago, forwarded through 2 defunct email addresses before finding me. The town was organizing a heritage weekend, they said, commemorating the logging history of this stretch. They wanted survivors of the old swimming hole to share stories. My first instinct was to delete it. My second was to accept. The third was to bring my son, to show him where his father learned to be afraid of calm water. Except my son is visiting his mother this month, and I'm standing here alone, watching the current that shouldn't exist in water this still. The lake upstream, they built it in the 90s, should have changed everything. The ranger confirmed it when I arrived yesterday, hiking down from the parking lot with my overnight pack and my memories. The dam altered the flow patterns, he explained, redirecting the seasonal floods and creating these strange pockets of stillness where the old rapids used to rage. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of eager earnestness that comes from believing nature can be cataloged and understood. He didn't mention the eddies that spiral in the wrong direction, or the way the water seems darker in certain spots despite the uniform depth. He didn't need to. I could see them from the bank, those circular patterns that pulled clockwise when everything else moved downstream. I asked about them anyway, keeping my voice casual, and he frowned. The locals avoid this section, he admitted. Something about the underground channels. The bedrock is limestone, full of caves that connect in unexpected ways. Sometimes fishermen report feeling tugs on their lines from impossible angles, or losing tackle to snags that weren't there on previous trips. 2 men disappeared in the 80s while fishing at dusk, their boat found upright and undisturbed, their rods still set with fresh bait. The search teams dragged the river for weeks and found nothing. The bedrock shifts, he added, almost apologetically. The channels change. What's solid one season becomes hollow the next. It's all documented in the geological surveys, but people prefer the mystery. I pitched my tent on the same flat clearing where my family used to camp. The fire ring is still there, older stones added to the circle my father built. As I arranged my sleeping bag and checked my provisions, I kept glancing at the water. The afternoon sun turned it amber and gold, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, and I tried to pinpoint the exact spot where I'd gone under. It should have been obvious. The fallen tree was massive, a white oak that had toppled decades before my birth, its trunk creating a natural dam across the current. except the tree was gone, not rotted away or broken up, simply absent, with no evidence it had ever existed. The bank showed no scar where its roots had torn free, and the Army Corps survey map I'd printed that morning confirmed what my eyes reported. No obstruction at that location in any record. I told myself memory is unreliable. 20 years could easily conflate locations, exaggerate details, invent landmarks that served narrative convenience. Children don't understand spatial relationships. The tree must have been somewhere else, and I'd simply misremembered which bend of the river had tried to drown me. But when I knelt at the water's edge and scooped up a handful of sand, it felt exactly as I remembered, fine as silk, dissolving between my fingers like it wanted to become liquid. The kind of sand that would give way beneath weight, that would funnel down into hidden gaps with the consistency of an hourglass. I tested the current by tossing a stone, a smooth, palm-sized river rock with a distinctive white quartz vein running through its center. I watched it arc through the air and disappear beneath the surface with barely a splash. The ripples spread and faded. Normal. Predictable. 30 seconds later, the same stone rolled onto the bank 2 feet from my boots. I picked it up with hands that wanted to shake. Same size, same weight, same quartz vein, running through the granite like a scar. But where it had been dry and warm from sitting on the shore, it was now cold and slick, covered in mud that smelled of deep places. Not the sandy bottom I could see in the shallows, but dark sediment thick with decomposition. The kind of mud that comes from caves where light has never reached. I dropped it like it had burned me, and immediately felt foolish. Rivers carry things. Underwater currents create eddies. Objects circle back. There were a dozen rational explanations for a stone returning to shore, even if this particular stone seemed too familiar, too impossible in its specificity. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to replicate the phenomenon. I threw rocks of different sizes, marked them with my pocket knife, tracked their trajectories. None came back. They sank and stayed sunk, visible on the sandy bottom until they weren't, swallowed by depth and distance. I told myself I'd imagined the quartz vein, that any river rock might look like any other, that stress and nostalgia were playing tricks on my perception. But as dusk approached and the light took on that golden quality that exists only in the hour before sunset, I found myself checking the bank, watching for returns that didn't come, listening to the water in ways I hadn't since childhood, when I'd believed rivers had voices if you paid attention. The ranger stopped by my camp just before dark, making his rounds. He asked if I needed anything, if I'd found the swimming hole nostalgic or disappointing. People usually felt one or the other, he said. The past never quite matches memory. I asked him about the channels again, specifically if objects could travel through them, if something dropped in one location could emerge from another, carried by underground current. He hesitated before answering. The caves are extensive, he admitted. Divers have mapped some of the passages, but it's dangerous work. The limestone dissolves in unpredictable patterns. New tunnels open, old ones collapse. There are sections where the river runs invisible beneath the bedrock, entire tributaries that never see daylight. Some of the locals claim items go missing from the banks, fishing gear, camping supplies, that sort of thing, and turn up miles away, or years later, in places they shouldn't be. The way he said it made it clear he included himself among the locals who'd experienced this. His flashlight beam swept across the water, catching something that made him pause. A ripple pattern moving against the current, spiraling inward like water circling a drain. He watched it for a long moment before clearing his throat. Used to see more of those, he said quietly. The eddies. They've been appearing more frequently the last few months. The geologists say it's erosion, new channels opening. But the patterns don't match any standard hydraulic model. He left shortly after, reminding me to keep my food secured against raccoons and to maintain the fire safely. His departure felt more like an escape, the way he hurried up the trail without looking back at the river. I stood by the dying fire, watching darkness settle over water that seemed to generate its own shadows, and wondered what exactly I'd come here to prove. The tent offered no comfort. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest at night. The chorus of frogs, the rustle of leaves, the occasional splash of something entering or leaving the water. Normal sounds. Expected sounds. The sounds of a living ecosystem going about its nocturnal business. But underneath them, almost too faint to distinguish from imagination, came the rhythmic creak of oars in oarlocks. The dip and pull of someone rowing with steady, practiced strokes. The sound grew louder as I listened, or perhaps I simply focused on it until it became the only thing I could hear. Dip, pull, creak. Dip, pull, creak. Moving upstream against the current with mechanical precision. I unzipped the tent and looked out into darkness barely touched by the fire's last embers. The river stretched before me, mercury dark and still, its surface broken only by those spiraling eddies that turned the wrong direction. No boat, no silhouette against the stars, no ripples to mark a hull's passage. But the sound continued, regular as a heartbeat, and I understood with a certainty that went beyond reason that whatever rowed those invisible oars was searching, moving back and forth along the bank, checking every shadow, investigating every possible place where something might hide or return. I stayed frozen at the tent's entrance, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The rowing stopped directly in front of my camp. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. A listening silence, an evaluating silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hear your own pulse hammering in your skull. Then it moved on, continuing upstream with the same measured cadence, and I realized I'd been holding my breath until my lungs burned. I didn't sleep. How could I? I lay there replaying the ranger's words about things that go missing and turn up where they shouldn't be, about fishermen who disappeared leaving no trace, about a river that keeps changing its channels beneath the earth. I thought about the stone that returned, covered in mud from elsewhere, about the sandy bottom that had given way beneath an 11-year-old's feet and pulled him through darkness to emerge somewhere impossible, about what it means when a river remembers you. Dawn came slowly, the light filtering through tent fabric in shades of gray before resolving into morning. I emerged stiff and unrested, my fire reduced to cold ash, my supplies untouched by any earthly scavenger. The river looked innocent in the early light, pretty even, with mist rising from its surface in delicate wisps. The kind of place you'd bring family for a weekend. The kind of place where children laugh and splash and learn to swim. I walked to the bank and stared down into water clear enough to count pebbles on the bottom. 6 feet deep, perhaps 8 at its deepest point, easily searchable by any competent dive team. Yet 2 fishermen had vanished here without a trace, their bodies never recovered, their fate relegated to the category of unsolved mysteries that dot every rural landscape. I was preparing to break camp when I noticed the marks. They surrounded my tent in a rough circle, pressed into the soft earth. Impressions that might have been footprints if footprints came in irregular clusters, or if feet pressed down with weight, distributed in patterns no human skeleton could create. They were freshest near the river's edge and grew fainter toward my camp, as if something had approached and then retreated, testing boundaries or gathering courage, or simply observing from the darkness while I'd lain paralyzed in my sleeping bag. I photographed them with my phone, knowing the images would prove nothing. Mud is mud. Impressions are impressions. They could be animal tracks, or water damage, or the result of rain I hadn't noticed falling in the night. They could be anything except what they actually were. Evidence that something had visited in darkness, drawn by fire or presence, or some quality specific to me. The ranger found me packing up. He looked relieved that I was leaving, then embarrassed by his relief. He asked if I'd had a good night, and I nearly laughed at the mundane politeness of the question. I asked him instead if he'd ever heard the rowing sounds, the oars in the darkness. His face closed like a door. "That's old stories," he said. "Logging camps used to line this stretch. Men working far from home, lonely and superstitious. They heard things in the night and made up explanations. It's just water moving through the underground channels. The acoustics can make it sound like other things, but I could see he'd heard them. could see in the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes that he'd stood on this bank in darkness and listened to the searching, rhythmic motion of oars that pulled no boat through water that showed no wake. I was loading my pack when I found the second stone. It sat on top of my sleeping bag, positioned with the deliberate precision of something placed rather than dropped. The same white quartz vein, the same palm-sized weight, but now it was dry again. The mud cleaned away to reveal granite polished smooth by decades of current. And carved into its surface, shallow but unmistakable, was a single word in letters that might have been scratched with a fingernail or a fishhook or something else. Return. I showed it to the ranger, even though I knew he'd find a rational explanation. Probably kids, he said, not quite convincingly. They come down here sometimes to scare each other with the old stories. Someone saw your tent and decided to play a prank. But his hand trembled slightly when he touched the stone, and he pulled away quickly, wiping his palm on his uniform pants as if something had transferred from granite to skin. His eyes went to the river, to those wrong-turning eddies, and I watched him make a decision. You shouldn't come back here, he said quietly. Some places don't want to be revisited. Some places keep better records than we do about who passed through them. I asked him what he meant, but he was already walking away, hiking up the trail with the purposeful stride of someone fleeing something they couldn't name. I stood alone with my pack and my photographs and my stone with its carved message, and I understood that I'd been given a warning, or an invitation. The drive home took 4 hours. I kept the stone on the passenger seat, glancing at it periodically as if it might vanish or change or reveal some additional message. It did none of those things. It remained simply a river rock with a quartz vein and a carved word, simultaneously ordinary and impossible. I'm writing this 3 days after returning. The stone sits on my desk, a paperweight or a trophy, or a reminder of debts unpaid. I haven't told anyone about the trip, not my ex-wife when she called about scheduling, not my son when he texted asking if we could go camping sometime. How do you explain that you visited the place that almost kept you and discovered it's still waiting? Because that's what haunts me more than the rowing sounds, or the impossible returns, or the message carved in granite. Not that the river tried to take me at 11 and failed, but that it's been patient. That it's maintained some record of our interrupted transaction, noted my absence in whatever ledger such places keep, and marked me for eventual collection. The ranger's words echo. Things go missing and turn up where they shouldn't be. Objects, gear, fishermen who leave no trace. I think about that sandy bottom giving way, about being pulled through darkness beneath a tree that doesn't appear on any map, about emerging downstream with no memory of the journey. I think about channels that change, about underground passages that connect in ways geology says they shouldn't, about a river that doesn't forget, and I think about the simple physics of it. If something dropped in one place can emerge in another, carried by hidden current through secret passages, then what about the things that go down and never come back up? Where do they go? How long does the river hold them before deciding they're ready to return? I've started sleeping poorly. Sometimes I wake in darkness convinced I hear oars creaking in rhythm outside my window, searching along the suburban streets with the same patient cadence they use along the riverbank. I tell myself it's anxiety, or guilt, or the persistent trauma of a childhood drowning that never quite finished happening. But this morning I found mud on my sheets, the same dark sediment that had covered the stone, thick with the smell of deep places. And there are marks on my walls, faint impressions at baseboard level, as if something had pressed against the plaster while passing through the room. Testing, searching, reminding me of business left unconcluded. My son wants to go camping. He's 12 now, a year older than I was when the river tried to keep me, and he's been asking about places we could explore together. Father-son adventures, he calls them, the kind of bonding experiences that build character and create memories. I tell him maybe next month, maybe after his mother's vacation, maybe when the weather's better, or my schedule clears, or any of a dozen reasonable delays. But what I'm really calculating is whether the debt is mine alone, or whether rivers accept substitutions. Whether they'd be satisfied with a son for a father who escaped, A generation later, but close enough to count as return. The stone sits on my desk, its carved message clear in the lamplight. Return. Not a question, not a request. A simple statement of eventual inevitability, like water flowing downhill or objects seeking their lowest point. The river has its own currents, the ranger said, its own channels that change and shift and connect in ways we don't understand. Its own ways of bringing things home. I should throw the stone away. Should forget the trip and the sounds and the impossible returns. Should convince myself it was stress or imagination, or the kind of experience that seems significant only because we decide it is. But I keep it on my desk where I can see it. This smooth granite reminder that some debts compound with interest, that some places maintain better records than we do, that some currents run too deep to map or understand or escape. And on nights when I can't sleep, when I lie in darkness listening to sounds that might be oars or might be nothing, I wonder, if I do return, when I return, will the river finally complete the journey it started 20 years ago? Will I wake downstream with no memory of the passage? Or will I remember everything? Will I resurface it all? Or will I join the fishermen and the lost tackle and all the other things that went down and never came back up? Held in limestone passages where the current runs invisible and eternal. The carved word gives no answers. It simply sits there, patient as stone, patient as water, patient as the river that tried once to keep me and has been waiting ever since for me to honor our interrupted transaction. My son sent another text this morning. 3 words. Camping this weekend. The stone seems heavier today. The mud on my sheets has dried to powder that smells of rot and mineral. And somewhere in New Hampshire, a river runs through channels that shift and change, creating eddies that turn the wrong direction, carrying things from one place to another through passages that shouldn't exist. I haven't answered my son yet. I'm not sure which response the river would prefer, but I'm increasingly certain it will collect its due, one way or another, in timing and circumstances of its own choosing. Because rivers don't forget, and some currents run deeper than we imagine, and 20 years is nothing to water that's been flowing for millennia. The stone grows colder in my hand. Outside, despite the dry forecast, I hear the distant sound of rowing. Steady, rhythmic, searching, coming closer, always closer. And I understand finally what it means when water returns what it borrowed. Not everything that comes back is the same as what went down. Not everything that surfaces is meant to stay surfaced. Some things are just checking in, confirming addresses, making sure the debt is remembered, making sure we remember where we belong. Story 6. The fire was dying when I first smelled it. Not smoke, not pine sap crackling in the flames. Something else. Something that didn't belong in the clean mountain air of northern Idaho. It was the scent of wet fur left too long in a closed space, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood or rusted iron. The kind of smell that makes your hindbrain scream before your conscious mind catches up. I'd been staring at the coals for maybe 20 minutes, watching them pulse from orange to deep red, when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, the way it does when night settles into these mountains, but all at once. My breath became visible in the span of 3 heartbeats. The fire guttered, flames shrinking down to nothing more than blue ghosts dancing over charred wood. That's when the lights appeared. 2 pale yellow orbs, maybe 8 feet off the ground, just beyond the reach of what little firelight remained. They didn't move at first, just hung there in the absolute black between the pines, reflecting the dying embers with an animal sheen that shouldn't have been possible at that distance. Too high for a wolf, too still for anything living. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, the warning he'd given me on the last hunting trip we took together, 3 weeks before the stroke took his words away. "They're patient," he'd said, staring at this exact spot with eyes that looked through me instead of at me. "They don't rush. They count." I reached for the flashlight hanging from my belt loop, fingers clumsy with cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The metal casing felt wrong in my grip. Too light, too insubstantial against whatever was watching me from the tree line. I thumbed the switch. Nothing. Tried again. The bulb flickered once. Died. Third attempt produced the same anemic pulse of light before darkness swallowed it again. Fresh batteries. I'd checked them twice before leaving the truck. The yellow lights hadn't moved, but they'd changed. Narrowed. The way a cat's eyes do before it pounces, pupils contracting to vertical slits. I could feel the weight of that gaze pressing against my chest, my throat, crawling over my skin like invisible insects. "Don't run," Grandfather had said, gripping my wrist with fingers gone skeletal and spotted with age. "Running means you're prey. They count every step you take. They know when you break." So I didn't run. I stood, keeping my movements slow and deliberate, and began walking backward toward the truck. 20 yards through darkness that felt thick as water, every footfall deliberate and measured. The fire hissed one last time and went out completely, leaving me with nothing but starlight and those unwavering yellow eyes. That's when I heard it. Thump. A footfall, heavy and deliberate, off to my right. Not where the lights were, somewhere else, circling around through the trees. Thump, closer now, from my left. The sound was wrong. Too heavy for a deer, too measured for a bear. It had rhythm, purpose. Thump, behind me, directly behind me. Thump. I kept walking, forcing myself not to turn, not to acknowledge what my peripheral vision was screaming at me to see. The truck materialized out of the darkness 10 yards away. 5. The footfalls stopped. I reached the driver's door, fumbled the handle open, and pulled myself inside in one continuous motion. The dome light blazed on, working perfectly, of course, flooding the cab with harsh white light that made the darkness outside seem even more absolute. I locked the doors, knowing how useless that was, how thin that metal skin felt against whatever was out there. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over on the first crank, and I've never been more grateful for American engineering in my life. I didn't turn on the headlights, didn't want to see what might be standing in front of the truck, just put it in reverse and backed down the logging road until I could turn around, gravel pinging against the undercarriage like hailstones. It wasn't until I'd driven 5 miles, until the old campsite was well behind me, and the main highway stretched ahead in a ribbon of broken yellow lines, that I remembered the audio recorder. I'd set it up that afternoon, mounted on a tripod near the fire pit. It was supposed to capture the ambient sounds of the forest at night, something about wildlife patterns and nocturnal activity that I'd told myself was the reason I'd come back to this place. The real reason sat heavier in my gut, unacknowledged. I needed to know if Grandfather had been losing his mind in those final years, or if there was something else, something worse. The recorder was still there when I came back the next morning, mist rising off the ground in pale sheets. The fire pit was cold, filled with ash and half-burned logs arranged in a pattern I didn't remember making. But the device was untouched, red light still blinking to show it was recording. I didn't listen to it there. Packed it into the truck alongside my gear and drove back to the motel in town, a sagging 2-story affair with a neon sign that only half worked. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, but it had 4 walls and a lock, and that was enough. The audio file was 4 hours and 17 minutes long. The first hour was exactly what I expected. Crickets, the crack and pop of burning wood, wind moving through pine branches. Then, at the 1 hour and 32-minute mark, the ambient sound changed. The crickets stopped. The wind went dead. For maybe 10 seconds, there was nothing but the hiss of the recorder's microphone picking up its own internal noise. Then came the footsteps. Thump, 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 thump. 4 of them, heavy and deliberate, moving in a slow circle around the recorder. I could hear the crunch of pine needles, the snap of a small twig. The sound was close, maybe 6 feet from the microphone. At the end of the 4th step, there was a pause. Just silence, stretching out for 15 seconds that felt like hours. Then a sound I couldn't identify, low and resonant, almost below the range of hearing. Not quite a growl, not quite breathing. It made my teeth ache and sent sympathetic vibrations through my chest, even through the tinny laptop speakers. The footsteps resumed. Thump, 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 thump. Another circle, this one tighter, closer. The fourth step stopped directly behind where I would have been sitting. I could hear something else now, underneath the footfalls, a wet, rhythmic sound. Breathing, maybe, or something approximating it. This pattern repeated 7 more times over the next hour. 4 steps. A pause. That subsonic resonance. Always circling, always stopping in the same spot, directly behind where the fire had been. At the 3-hour mark, there was a new sound. Scratching, metal on stone, deliberate and measured. It went on for 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and when it stopped, I heard something that made my blood go cold. A voice. Low and measured, words blurred beyond recognition but unmistakably human in cadence. It sounded like someone speaking underwater, syllables stretched and distorted but following a pattern, a syntax. The voice spoke for maybe 30 seconds, paused, then repeated the same sequence. 3 times total. Then nothing. Just wind and the return of crickets and the eventual birdsong of dawn. I played it back 4 times, trying to convince myself I was hearing things wrong, that it was just wind or animal sounds or the recorder malfunctioning. But I'd worked in audio engineering for 3 years before switching to forestry work. I knew clean recordings from corrupted ones. This was clean. That afternoon, I drove out to my grandfather's old house. The place had been sitting empty since he died, locked in probate hell with my uncle and aunt fighting over who got what. I had the key the attorney had given me, the one that was supposed to be temporary until the estate settled. The house smelled like dust and old paper. I went straight for his study, the cluttered room where he'd spent his last years poring over maps and journals, writing in a cramped hand that got shakier as the months wore on. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, coffee cup with a ring of mold, reading glasses folded on top of a leather-bound notebook, pens scattered across water-stained blotters. I opened the notebook. The entries went back 15 years, long before I'd noticed any decline in his mental state. Each one was dated, time-stamped, and disturbingly consistent. He'd documented every trip to that campsite, every night spent by that fire. The entries grew denser as the years progressed, pages filled with observations written in increasingly frantic handwriting. September 14th. 4 steps, always 4, measured pace, approximately 2. 3 seconds between each fall, circles clockwise, pauses behind position, duration, 8 minutes, 34 seconds. October 3rd, smell stronger tonight, wet fur, iron, something else. Sweet. No, wrong word, old, ancient. Fire died at 23:47, 15 minutes earlier than calculated burn rate. Eyes appeared, 0, 4 seconds later. November 18th, it knows my name. I'm certain now. The sound it makes, not speaking, but close, like something remembering how words work, testing them. I should stop coming here. I won't. The final entry was dated 2 days before his stroke. They count everything. Steps, breaths, heartbeats. They're patient because they already know how many you have left. Found my father's watch tonight, buried near the fire pit. He lost it 40 years ago on his last hunting trip. He said something followed him home. Died of a heart attack 3 months later. The watch was still keeping time. My hands had gone numb. I flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank, until the very last one. A single sentence, written in a hand so shaky it was barely legible. It's not hunting us. It's remembering us. I closed the notebook and sat in the gathering darkness of my grandfather's study, listening to the house settle around me. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and deep blue. I should have left then. Should have gotten in the truck and driven until Idaho was a fading line in my rearview mirror. Instead, I went back to the campsite that night. I told myself it was to retrieve the tripod I'd left behind. That was a lie, and I knew it even as I drove the logging road with my headlights cutting tunnels through the dark. The truth sat heavy in my chest. I needed to see it again. Needed to confirm what my rational mind insisted couldn't be real. The fire pit was exactly as I'd left it, ash stirred by wind into small drifts. I didn't build a new fire, Just sat in the truck with the engine running, heater on, watching the darkness beyond my headlights. At 11:47 p.m. the engine died. No sputter, no warning, just a click and sudden silence. The headlights stayed on for maybe 3 seconds, then faded to nothing. The dashboard lights went dark. My phone screen wouldn't illuminate when I pressed the button. The smell came next. Wet fur and iron and something underneath. Something my grandfather had tried to describe with the word old. He was wrong. It wasn't old. It was outside of time entirely, existing in a space where decay and growth happened simultaneously. I didn't see the eyes this time. I felt them. A pressure against my back, even through the truck's cab, even through metal and glass and the rational certainty that nothing could be inside with me. It was the feeling of being studied by something vast and patient, something that had been doing this long before my grandfather was born, before his father, before this forest grew up around the bones of whatever came before. Thump. The truck rocked slightly. Thump. Another impact, gentle but insistent. Thump. I could hear it circling now, footfalls crunching in gravel and pine needles. Thump. It stopped directly behind the cab. The silence stretched out, seconds becoming minutes, becoming an eternity of held breath and racing heartbeat. Then came that sound, that subsonic rumble that made my bones ache. It was closer now, much closer, and underneath it, barely audible, I heard the same distorted cadence I'd caught on the recording. Not words, but the memory of them, the shape of language without meaning. My hand found the door handle without conscious thought. I pulled it, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the darkness. I don't remember making that decision, don't remember my rational mind signing off on walking away from the only shelter I had. But I found myself standing beside the truck, breathing mist into air so cold it burned my lungs, and I was calm, unnaturally calm. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I didn't turn to look, kept my eyes forward, on the dark outline of pine trees against the slightly less dark sky. Thump. Right beside me. Close enough that I should have been able to reach out and touch whatever was making that sound. Thump. Behind me again, circling. Thump. To my left. The pattern was the same as the recording, the same as my grandfather's notes. 4 steps, always 4, and then thump. It stopped behind me. I could feel breath on the back of my neck. Not warm or cold, but neutral. The breath of something that existed in a temperature outside the spectrum I could comprehend. That subsonic rumble started again, and this time I heard the words underneath. Not English, not any language I recognized, but I understood them anyway, the way you understand the meaning of a dream even when it makes no logical sense. We count, it said. We remember. We return. My foot scraped against something metallic. I looked down, difficult in the darkness, but my eyes had adjusted enough to see the glint of silver against black earth. I knelt, slowly, and brushed dirt away from a small object half buried in the ground. My grandfather's watch. The same one his father had lost. The same one my grandfather had found and reburied, completing whatever cycle this thing demanded. The watch was ticking. I picked it up, felt the weight of it in my palm. The second hand swept around the face with mechanical precision, each tick perfectly spaced. 11:52 p.m. 5 minutes had passed since the truck died, though it felt like hours. When I looked up, the presence was gone. Just darkness and trees and the gradually returning sound of crickets. The smell faded. The oppressive weight lifted from my shoulders. The truck started on the first try. I drove home with the watch in my pocket, ticking against my thigh like a second heartbeat. Didn't stop at the motel. Drove straight through the night until I reached my apartment 3 hours away, in a city with streetlights and traffic and the comforting noise of human civilization. That was 3 weeks ago. The watch is on my nightstand now, still keeping perfect time. I've tried to get rid of it, thrown it in dumpsters, left it in gas station bathrooms, dropped it down a storm drain. It always comes back. In my jacket pocket, my work bag, once in my shower, sitting on the soap dish like it had always been there. Last night, I smelled wet fur and iron. My apartment is on the 6th floor. I haven't built a fire since Idaho, haven't even lit a candle, but I keep finding myself looking up campsite locations online, measuring distances, calculating drive times. The urge grows stronger each day, a compulsion I can't explain and don't fully understand. My grandfather wrote that it's not hunting us, that it's remembering us. I think he was wrong about one thing. It's not just remembering, it's calling us home. And I'm starting to understand that you can't ignore a call that knows exactly how many heartbeats you have left to answer it. The watch keeps ticking, and I keep counting. Story 7. The dog stopped first. That's what I remember most clearly. Not the thing itself, but the way both hounds went rigid mid-stride, haunches locked, ears forward. We'd been hiking the ridge trail for 3 hours, that nameless path that winds through the oldest part of the Appalachians where the trees grow thick enough to strangle the afternoon light. The air had that particular autumn weight to it, heavy with the smell of decay and wet bark, and I'd been thinking about nothing in particular when both dogs froze like they'd hit an invisible wall. I followed their gaze to a cluster of white birches, maybe 20 yards off the trail. The bark peeled in long strips, exposing that pale flesh underneath that always looks too much like skin. Between the trunks, something stood. At first, my brain tried to make it human. That's what brains do. They reach for the familiar, even when every instinct screams otherwise. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, joints bending at angles that didn't quite match the human skeleton. And the way it held itself, perfectly still, head cocked at an angle that suggested curiosity more than threat. The silence pressed against my eardrums. No birds, no wind. Just my breathing and the dog's low whine, almost subsonic. I called out. A simple greeting, nothing more. My voice sounded flat in that dead air, absorbed by the trees before it could echo. Then it answered. The same word in my voice, but pitched higher, stretched thin like a recording played at the wrong speed. The timing was off by maybe half a second, just enough to create that uncanny valley effect that makes your spine go cold. It wasn't mockery, it was practice. The thing tilted its head further, past the point where a human neck would stop, and then it rose. Unfolded is a better word. It got taller in a way that suggested it had been compressing itself, making itself smaller, more human-sized. When it reached its full height, the top of its head cleared the lowest branches. I don't remember deciding to leave. My body made that choice while my conscious mind was still trying to process what I was seeing. The dogs bolted ahead of me, and I followed, my boots hammering against the packed earth, my lungs burning with the sudden exertion. I didn't look back. Some part of me knew that looking back would be a mistake. That night I sat on my cabin's porch with a bottle of whiskey and tried to convince myself I'd seen a bear. Bears stand on their hind legs. They're curious. They can be pale-colored, especially in this light. But bears don't talk. The woods around my cabin are thick with hemlock and oak, and in the growing darkness, they seem to press closer to the house. I'd lived here for 2 years, seeking solitude after the divorce, and I'd grown comfortable with the isolation. But tonight, the solitude felt different. It felt watched. Around midnight, I heard my voice coming from somewhere in the tree line. Not exactly my voice, that same falsetto imitation, running through phrases I'd used during the hike. Questions I'd asked the dogs, comments about the weather, random observations about the trail. It repeated them with varying degrees of accuracy, stumbling over certain sounds, smoothing out others. Practicing, I stayed very still, barely breathing, my hand tight around the whiskey bottle. The rehearsal went on for over an hour, my words coming back to me in that wrong-pitched echo, getting clearer, more confident. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found the footprints in the mud near the porch steps. My boot prints, or close enough. The same tread pattern, the same size. But the gait was off. Too wide in some places, too narrow in others, like someone who'd studied walking but hadn't quite mastered the rhythm. They led from the tree line to the porch, circled the cabin twice, then headed back into the woods. I told myself it was just mud. Mud can play tricks. Water can distort. I'd been drinking, but I also knew that I'd stayed on the porch the entire night, and these prints were fresh, pressed into the dew-damp earth. Over the next few days, I tried to maintain my routine. I chopped wood, repaired the chicken coop fence, sorted through boxes of books I'd been meaning to organize. But the feeling of being observed never left. It was strongest at the edges of my vision, that sense of movement that disappears when you turn your head. The dogs refused to go beyond the immediate clearing around the cabin. They'd venture to the tree line, hackles up, then retreat. The voice continued its practice sessions every night. It was learning faster than seemed possible. By the third night, it had graduated from simple phrases to more complex sentences. It captured my cadence, the way I dropped the ends of words when I was tired. It even picked up my laugh, that short, humorless bark I'd developed over the past year. I started talking less, rationing my words, but it didn't matter. It seemed to remember everything I'd ever said on that trail, and it worked through the catalog systematically, perfecting each sound, each inflection. Sometimes it would repeat the same phrase dozens of times, adjusting the tone incrementally, like a musician tuning an instrument. On the fourth night, I heard it on the porch, the distinctive creak of the third board from the left, the one I always stepped over but visitors inevitably hit. Then footsteps, deliberate and measured, pacing back and forth. I sat in my bed, rifle across my lap, watching the door handle. It never turned. The footsteps continued for 20 minutes, then descended the steps and faded into the woods. In the morning, I found that the creature had traced my entire evening routine, the path I took from the woodpile to the door, the spot where I stood to smoke before bed, the way I leaned against the porch railing while watching the sunset, all recorded in those slightly wrong boot prints, that alien gait approximating my own. I considered leaving, loading the truck and driving until I hit a town big enough to have streetlights and neighbors within shouting distance. But something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. This was my land, my refuge. I'd fled here to escape other people, and I wasn't about to be driven out by whatever this was. Besides, where would I go? What would I tell people? That something in the woods was learning to be me. I started noticing other signs. The woodpile rearranged in the exact pattern I'd stacked it, but the pieces slightly off, like someone had photographed it, scrambled it, then tried to rebuild from memory. My tools moved in the shed, not stolen, just relocated, placed where I would have put them if I'd been organizing in a hurry. A coffee mug on the porch railing that I couldn't remember leaving there, but that I might have. The ambiguity was the worst part. I could never be completely sure what I'd done and what it had done. My memory felt unreliable, slippery. Had I really walked to the property line yesterday, or had I just thought about walking there? Did I split that particular log, or had I imagined it? I started leaving tests for myself. Small objects arranged in specific patterns that I could verify, but even that became uncertain when I found my arrangements duplicated in other parts of the property. The same configuration of stones, but near the creek instead of the porch. Had I done that and forgotten? Was I sleepwalking? The voice stopped coming from the woods. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. For 3 nights, silence. The dogs relaxed slightly, venturing further from the cabin. I began to hope that maybe it had moved on, found some other obsession. Then I heard my voice inside the cabin. I was in the living room reading by lamplight when I heard myself in the kitchen. Not the falsetto imitation anymore. This was perfect. My exact voice, my exact tone, asking where I'd put the coffee filters, the question I'd asked myself earlier that day when I was alone. The dogs didn't react. They lay by the fireplace, completely calm. I sat frozen, the book sliding from my hands, as I heard myself moving through the kitchen, opening cupboards, muttering about the grocery list. The sounds were precise, the squeak of that one cabinet hinge, the rattle of the silverware drawer. I forced myself to stand, to walk toward the kitchen doorway. The sounds continued, unbothered by my approach. I could hear my breathing in there, that slightly wheezy inhale I get when the weather changes. When I reached the doorway, the kitchen was empty, but the cabinet doors were open, the silverware drawer pulled out, and on the counter, arranged in a neat row, were the coffee filters. I'd been looking for those this afternoon. I'd said so out loud, to no one, a verbal tick of living alone. And something had been listening. That's when I understood. It wasn't just learning my voice anymore. It was learning my patterns, my thoughts, my routines. It was studying not just how I sounded, but how I was. And it was getting better at being me than I was. The next few days blurred together. I stopped trusting my own actions. When I found myself standing in the yard with no memory of going outside, I didn't know if I'd blacked out or if it had moved me. When I discovered I'd written a shopping list in my own handwriting, items I needed but hadn't consciously thought about, I couldn't be sure whose thoughts had guided the pen. The dogs started treating me differently. Sometimes they'd greet me normally, tails wagging, pressing against my legs. Other times they'd back away, ears flat, growling at something they sensed but I couldn't identify. I was learning to recognize the difference in their behavior, to know when I was really me. Except I wasn't sure what really me meant anymore. I caught my reflection in the window one night and didn't recognize the expression on my face, not immediately. It was my face, my features, but the set of the mouth was wrong, the angle of the head too tilted. I adjusted my posture, watched the reflection mirror the movement, and felt a wave of vertigo so intense I had to sit down. Was I copying it, or was it copying me? The boot prints in the mud had become a daily occurrence, but now I couldn't always tell which ones I'd made and which were the imitations. Sometimes I'd follow a trail of prints away from the cabin, trying to determine which direction I'd gone, only to find they led nowhere, just stopped in the middle of the clearing, as if I'd vanished mid-stride. I started talking to myself more, narrating my actions, trying to maintain a sense of continuity. I'd say things like, "Now I'm making coffee," or "I'm going to chop wood now," just to anchor myself in reality. But then I'd hear those same phrases repeated back to me, in my voice, when I was doing something else entirely. The timeline was collapsing. One morning, I woke to find I'd rearranged all the furniture in the cabin. Major pieces, the couch, the bookshelf, the dining table, moved during the night while I supposedly slept. The new arrangement was logical, even an improvement on the old layout. It was exactly how I'd been thinking about reorganizing things. In that idle way you plan projects you never get around to doing. But I hadn't done it. Or I had no memory of doing it. Or I had done it, and something was making me forget. The dogs were gone by the end of the second week. I woke up and they weren't in the cabin, weren't in the yard. I found tracks leading into the woods, the dogs' prints and a set of my boot prints, the gate only slightly off. I called for them, searched the property, but they'd vanished. They were smart dogs. They'd sensed something I was too stubborn to accept. I was alone now. Truly alone. Except I wasn't. That night, I sat on the porch with the rifle again, watching the tree line, and I heard myself walking through the woods. Not the voice, the actual sound of my footsteps, my breathing, the way my jacket rustled when I moved through underbrush. It circled the cabin, maintaining a constant distance, neither approaching nor retreating. I shouted into the darkness, challenging it to show itself. My voice came back to me instantly, perfectly synchronized now, shouting the exact same words from the exact same position I was standing, like an echo, but simultaneous, like hearing yourself in stereo. I fired the rifle into the air. The sound split the night, echoing off the mountains. In the silence that followed, I heard the rifle fire again. Same caliber, same direction. But I'd only fired once. That's when I started laughing. Or it started laughing. I couldn't tell anymore which impulse was mine and which was the response. The laughter doubled back on itself. My voice, and its voice, his voice, overlapping until I couldn't distinguish the original from the copy. I stopped. The laughter continued for another half-second, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute. I became very aware of my body, the way I was standing, the angle of my shoulders, the weight distribution on my feet. I felt watched, but not from outside, from inside, as if something was looking out through my eyes, studying my perspective, learning what it was like to be the original. I touched my face, felt the contours of my jaw, the stubble on my cheeks. My hands felt like my hands. My face felt like my face. But there was a wrongness to it, a slight disconnect, as if I was wearing a mask of myself. In the window glass, I could see my reflection. Behind it, in the dark cabin interior, stood another figure. Same height, same build, same posture. It raised its hand when I raised mine, mirrored my movements perfectly, but when I looked directly into the cabin, turning away from the window, there was nothing there. Just my furniture in its new arrangement, my things in their new places. My life, reorganized by something that was learning to live it better than I could. I walked inside, closed the door, locked it. The gesture felt performative, meaningless. Locks only work when you know what side of the door you're on. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, trying to write down what was happening, to create a record that would prove I was real, that my thoughts were my own. But as I wrote, I became aware that I couldn't remember deciding to get the notebook, couldn't remember sitting down. The impulse had felt natural, but was it mine? The words on the page were in my handwriting, but they described events I wasn't entirely sure I'd experienced. Had the thing really spoken on the trail, or had I imagined it? Were the boot prints real, or was I making them myself in some dissociative fugue state? What if there was no creature? What if I'd been alone this entire time, creating an external threat to explain the dissolution of my own identity? What if the real horror was that there was no mimic, just me, fracturing, losing coherence, watching myself become someone I didn't recognize? Or what if it was worse? What if there had been a creature, but it was already gone? What if it had finished its study, perfected its imitation, and replaced me so completely that I was now the copy, believing myself to be the original, while the real me was out there somewhere, watching, waiting to reclaim his life? I looked at my hands. They trembled slightly. I tried to stop the trembling, but it continued. Was it fear? Or was it something else? The imperfection of mimicry, the tell that would give me away. In the window, my reflection looked back at me. Behind it, in the dark glass, another face watched. Same features, same expression, but the eyes were slightly off, the pupils too wide, too dark, too deep. I stood up. The reflection stood up. I walked to the window. The reflection walked toward me. I pressed my palm against the glass. On the other side, another palm pressed back. I opened my mouth to speak, but I couldn't remember what I'd intended to say. The words had been there a moment ago, clear and purposeful, but now they were gone, replaced by silence. In that silence, I heard breathing. Two sets of lungs, perfectly synchronized. Two heartbeats, aligned. Two versions of the same thought, echoing in the space between what I was and what I had become. I stepped back from the window. The reflection stepped back too, but a fraction of a second slower. Just a fraction. Enough to notice. I spent the rest of the night watching that reflection, studying it for discrepancies, for proof of which side of the glass I was really on. But the longer I watched, the less certain I became. Every blink seemed to lag. Every breath fell slightly out of sync. By dawn, I could no longer tell which of us was the original. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that it didn't matter anymore. We were both real, both perfect, both incomplete. The mimic had learned everything it needed to know, and so had I. Story 8. The cold hit differently in Vermont. Not just the temperature, though it was brutal, 15 below without wind chill, but the quality of it. The way it seemed to seep through the chalet's old timber bones and settle in the spaces between walls, creating pockets of air that felt denser than they should. My brother Tobias had found the place on some obscure rental site, charmed by the low price and the promise of isolation for New Year's. We'd wanted quiet, a break from the city's relentless noise, and the photos showed exactly what we needed. a weathered A-frame tucked into dense pines, miles from the nearest town. What the photos hadn't shown was how the window seemed slightly wrong, reflecting things at angles that didn't quite match the room's geometry, or how the floorboards in the hallway creaked in sequence like someone pacing, even when nobody was there. We arrived on the 29th. The owner, a man who introduced himself simply as Mr. Holt, met us at the property line where the plowed road gave way to a private drive. He didn't offer to help with the bags, just handed over 2 sets of keys attached to wooden tags carved with intricate symbols I didn't recognize. His instructions were brief. The main door locked automatically from the inside at 11 p.m., a security feature installed after a break-in years ago. Once engaged, it couldn't be opened from either side without the emergency override, a red button hidden behind the circuit breaker panel in the basement. The heating was temperamental. The water took forever to get hot. Cell service was non-existent. He left before I could ask why anyone would install a lock that trapped you inside your own house. The first night was unremarkable. We unpacked, explored the 2-bedroom layout, made sandwiches from the groceries we'd brought. My dog Jasper, a 3-year-old mutt with more anxiety than sense, immediately claimed the rug in front of the wood stove as his territory. Tobias spent an hour trying to get the ancient television to work, finally giving up and pulling out a deck of cards instead. We played rummy until midnight, drinking the whiskey I'd packed, listening to the wind move through the pines like something vast and restless. I should have noticed it then. The way the shadows in the corners seemed too deep, too persistent even when we moved the lamps. The way Jasper kept lifting his head, ears swiveling toward the kitchen, a low whine building in his throat before subsiding into uneasy silence. The second night, December 30th, was when things began to wrong themselves. I woke to the sound of glass on glass, that specific clink of tumblers or wine glasses being moved, rearranged. The luminous dial on my watch showed 3:17 a.m. Tobias was asleep in the other bedroom, his snoring a familiar buzz through the thin walls. Jasper was curled against my legs, his body tense despite the appearance of sleep. I lay there, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that old houses made sounds, that the wind could create acoustic tricks. Then I heard the drawer, the kitchen's utility drawer, the one that stuck and required a specific angle of pull to open. Someone was opening it. My first thought was intruder, despite the automatic lock, despite being on the second floor of a chalet in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my phone, dead, despite having charged it, and eased out of bed. Jasper's eyes followed me, but he didn't move, didn't bark. That should have been my first real warning. Dogs bark at intruders. They bark at strangers. They don't lie silent and trembling while someone rifles through your kitchen. The hallway was darker than it should have been. We'd left the small lamp on near the bathroom, but its light seemed to stop at some invisible boundary, refusing to push more than a few feet into the corridor. I moved slowly, bare feet silent on the cold floorboards, hand trailing along the wall for guidance. The sounds continued, cabinet doors opening, the soft scrape of ceramic, the whisper of something being dragged across the counter. At the kitchen entrance, I stopped. The lights were off, but the moon through the window provided enough illumination to see the basic shapes of the room. The table, the chairs, the hulking mass of the old refrigerator. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound. The kitchen was empty, utterly still, and yet the sensation of presence was overwhelming, like standing too close to someone in a crowded elevator, feeling their breath on your neck without seeing them. I flipped the switch. Fluorescent light stuttered to life, harsh and revealing. Everything was in place. The dish rack undisturbed. The drawer closed. I stood there for 5 minutes, maybe longer, waiting for something else to happen, for some confirmation that I hadn't hallucinated the entire episode. The house creaked and settled around me. Normal sounds, old wood adjusting to temperature changes, nothing more. But walking back to my room, I felt it. That crawling certainty of being watched, of being the subject of an attention so focused it became almost physical. I checked on Tobias. Still asleep. Locked my door, though I couldn't explain why that would help against anything. Jasper had moved to the corner of the room, pressed against the wall, staring at the closed door with that terrible animal, knowing that something was fundamentally wrong. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning revealed the evidence I'd been unconsciously dreading. The kitchen looked like the aftermath of some bizarre ritual. Every plate we owned, 8 in total, had been removed from the cabinet and arranged on the floor in a tight spiral pattern, smallest in the center, radiating outward. They were perfectly aligned, each one precisely placed, the spacing so exact it looked machine-made. No chips, no breakage. Just this careful, deliberate geometry that had no reason to exist. Tobias found me staring at it, coffee forgotten in my hand. He asked what the hell had happened, and I found I couldn't answer in any way that wouldn't sound insane. I told him I didn't know. We'd both been asleep. The lock was engaged. Nobody could have gotten in. He asked why I would do this. His voice was careful, concerned, the way you'd speak to someone balanced on a ledge. I told him I didn't. He didn't believe me. I could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way he kept glancing between me and the spiral, calculating distances and possibilities. The unspoken question hung between us. Had I sleepwalked? Was this some kind of breakdown, stress-induced fugue state? I had no answers that would satisfy either of us. Then I saw the note. It was attached to the small corkboard by the door, the one where the previous renters had left recommendations for local restaurants and hiking trails. A piece of lined paper torn from the pad we'd seen on the counter yesterday. 3 words in handwriting I almost recognized as my own. Come back inside. My pen was still in my jacket pocket. I checked 3 times, pulling it out, examining it, trying to find some evidence of recent use. The ink was full, the tip clean. But that was my pen, a specific brand, a specific color, chewed at the end where I had a nervous habit of biting the cap. And that was my handwriting, or something so close to it that the differences might have been nothing more than the natural variation of writing while tired, or stressed, or slowly losing your grip on what was real. Tobias suggested we leave. Pack up, forfeit the deposit, drive back to Boston and forget this place existed. But something stopped me from agreeing immediately. A stubborn need to understand, to have an explanation that didn't involve admitting I was falling apart. I told him we'd stay one more night, through New Year's Eve. If anything else happened, we'd go. He agreed reluctantly, and we spent the day trying to recreate normalcy. We drove into town such as it was, a single main street with a grocery store and a diner. The food was adequate. The people were quiet, watching us with the casual suspicion small towns reserve for outsiders. Back at the chalet, we avoided talking about the plates or the note. Tobias set up his laptop to watch movies, downloading them earlier at the diner's Wi-Fi. I took Jasper for a walk, following a trail that wound through the pines until the house was lost from view, grateful for the temporary distance. The dog stayed close, refusing to range more than a few feet away, constantly looking back toward the chalet as if expecting something to follow us. When I tried to go deeper into the woods, he planted himself and refused to move, a low growl rumbling through his chest. We turned back. That evening, I made a decision that felt both rational and paranoid. I had a small motion-activated camera in my luggage, something I'd bought months ago for a freelance photography project and never used. I set it up in the kitchen, angled to capture the main area and the hallway entrance. The battery was fully charged, the memory card empty. If something happened again, I'd have proof. Evidence that would either confirm an intruder or reveal myself as the architect of my own nightmare. We went to bed early, both of us exhausted by the weight of unspoken tension. I kept Jasper in the room with me again, door locked, windows checked and rechecked. Tobias had suggested we sleep in shifts, keeping watch, but that seemed like admitting something we weren't ready to admit. Instead, we pretended tomorrow would bring clarity, that daylight would burn away whatever strange atmosphere had infected this place. I lay awake, counting my breaths, listening to the house. At some point, despite my intention to stay alert, I must have drifted off. When I opened my eyes again, my watch read 3:33 a.m. Not 3:17 like the night before, but close enough to feel deliberate. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Jasper was sitting up, rigid, staring at the door with that same terrible focus. No sounds from the kitchen this time. No drawers opening, no glass clinking. Just silence, heavy and expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. I lay there, not moving, trying to identify what had woken me. Then I felt it. The subtle change in air pressure that comes when a door opens somewhere in the house, even one several rooms away. The slight draft. The minute shift in temperature. Someone, something, was moving through the chalet. I didn't get up this time. Some instinct told me that whatever was happening, I didn't want to see it directly. Didn't want to confront it. Instead, I stayed frozen, listening to the almost imperceptible sounds of movement. Footsteps? Maybe. Or maybe just the house settling. My paranoia filling in the gaps with narrative where there was only random noise. Minutes passed. An hour. The sky outside began to lighten toward dawn. Jasper eventually lay back down, though his eyes never closed, never stopped watching the door. Morning came with the kind of crystalline winter light that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. I got up, surprised I'd slept at all, and went to check the camera before Tobias woke. My hands were shaking as I removed the memory card and plugged it into my laptop. The footage was there. 8 hours of still, empty kitchen. Fast-forwarding through it, I watched shadows lengthen and retreat, watched moonlight track across the floor, watched nothing happen. Until 3:33 a.m. For exactly 3 seconds, the image blurred, not like the camera had moved, but like something had passed between it and the scene it was recording, something that distorted light itself. A smear of darkness, vaguely human-shaped but wrong, too tall or too thin, or too something to be real. Then, in the next frame, a figure walked past the kitchen entrance. A man, moving down the hallway toward the bedrooms. The image quality was poor in the low light, but I could make out enough details. Dark hair, wearing what looked like the gray t-shirt I'd brought, the same sleep pants I'd worn to bed. I watched myself walk down the hallway at 3:33 a.m. while I absolutely knew, I had been in bed, awake, listening to the house breathe around me. The figure didn't look at the camera, didn't pause or hesitate, just walked with purpose toward the bedroom where I'd been lying, terrified and motionless. The footage continued for another 4 hours. Nothing else happened. The kitchen remained empty, undisturbed. When dawn light finally brightened the frame enough to see clearly, everything was exactly as we'd left it. No spiral of plates, no mysterious notes. Whatever the house had done the night before, it hadn't chosen to repeat. I sat there, staring at the laptop screen, trying to construct an explanation that wouldn't require me to accept the impossible. A technical glitch, motion blur combined with low light creating the illusion of a human figure. Compression artifacts, something. But the more I watched the footage, the more certain I became. That was me. Walking, moving with my gait, my posture, my specific way of leading with my right shoulder when I'm tired. The house grinds you down first, I thought, makes you doubt what you know to be true. Then it shows you proof of an impossibility and asks you to choose. Accept that reality is negotiable, or accept that you're losing your mind. Tobias found me in the kitchen, laptop open, watching the same 3 seconds of footage on repeat. I showed him without explanation, watched his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. He asked if it was possible I'd gotten up without remembering, some kind of fugue state or sleepwalking episode. I told him I hadn't slept, told him I'd been awake the entire time, that I would have known if I'd gotten up, that the floorboards creaked too loudly for me to have walked that hallway without hearing myself do it. He suggested we pack and leave immediately. His voice had an edge now, something sharper than concern. This time I agreed. But when we went to load the car, we found the keys were gone. Both sets. We'd left them on the hook by the door. I specifically remembered Tobias hanging them there yesterday afternoon. The hooks were empty. We searched the entire chalet. Every drawer, every pocket, every surface where keys might accidentally end up. Nothing. Like they'd been deliberately hidden or removed from the house entirely. Tobias tried the emergency override for the lock. Went down to the basement, found the circuit breaker panel, opened it. The red button was there, but when he pressed it, nothing happened. The lock didn't disengage. The door remained sealed, and we were trapped inside the house that bent reality, that duplicated its occupants, that wanted something from us I couldn't begin to understand. I'm writing this now on the 31st New Year's Eve afternoon. Tobias is sleeping, or pretending to, exhausted by panic. Jasper hasn't eaten in 24 hours, won't leave my side, flinches at sounds I can't hear. I've been checking the camera footage every few hours, watching for changes, for evidence of more impossibilities. The last clip shows something new. This morning at 3:33 a.m., we've learned to dread that specific time. The camera caught not one but two figures passing through the kitchen. Both looked like me, both moving with purpose, both heading toward the bedroom where I lay awake, feeling the walls press closer, wondering which version of myself would open the door first. I've stopped trying to explain it, stopped trying to rationalize or construct logical frameworks around the illogical. The house doesn't care about our need for sense. It folds reality the way you'd fold a piece of paper, brings edges together that shouldn't touch, creates duplicates or echoes or something worse that I don't have words for. Tobias thinks we should break a window, climb out that way. But I keep thinking about the note. Come back inside. Back inside from where? What were we trying to leave? And if we break our way out, what version of ourselves will we be releasing into the world? Tonight is New Year's Eve. Midnight will mark not just a new year, but our third night in this place that manufactures copies, that seems to accumulate versions of us like snow accumulating on a roof. Slowly, inexorably, until the weight becomes unbearable. I don't know what happens when the house is collected enough. I don't know if what walks out of here when the rental period ends will actually be us, or just something that learned our shapes well enough to pass. The camera is running again. This time I've positioned it to capture my bedroom. I need to see what comes through that door at 3:33. Need to know if I'll recognize myself in whatever face looks back. Tobias has agreed to stay awake with me, though I can see the doubt in his eyes when he looks at me now. That question he won't ask. Am I the real one? Or just the first copy that learned how to be convincing? The sun is setting. The lock engaged an hour ago with its decisive final click. Jasper is pressed against my leg, trembling. Soon it will be dark, and then it will be 3:33, and then we'll know. Or we won't. Maybe the worst part isn't the doubling itself, but the gradual realization that you can't be certain which version you are. The original, or one of the shadows. The thing that walked into this house 4 days ago, or something that's only been aware for hours, convinced of a history that isn't quite real. I keep checking my hands, my reflection in the darkened window, looking for some sign that I'm not what I remember being. But everything looks right, feels right, and that might be the most disturbing thing of all. The precision of it, the perfect mimicry. The camera's red light is blinking. Recording. In a few hours, I'll watch the footage and see what visited me while I thought I was keeping watch. See how many of me passed through that door. See if I'm still capable of telling the difference. The house is very quiet now. Waiting. We're all waiting. All the versions of us scattered through this structure that learned how to fold people the way it folds space. Somewhere in these walls, I suspect there are others, previous renters, people who thought they escaped, unaware they left echoes behind that never quite dissolved. Mr. Holt knew. That's why he wouldn't come inside. That's why the rental price was so low. That's why the lock traps you in at night. The house needs time to work, needs the forced proximity of its occupants trapped inside, while it learns their patterns, their mannerisms, the specific ways they move through space. It's 11:47 p.m. now. 13 minutes until midnight, until a new year, until we find out what this place has been building toward. Tobias is sitting across from me, and I realize I can't remember if he's been here the whole time or if he stepped out and came back, and whether that matters anymore. The worst part is that I'm not scared. I should be terrified, but instead I feel this strange calm, like someone who's been falling for so long they've stopped fearing the ground. Maybe that's how you know you're the copy, the absence of appropriate emotion, the simulation running just smooth enough to pass but missing some essential spark of survival instinct. Or maybe that's exactly what the original would think, second-guessing themselves into paralysis while the house continues its patient work of multiplication. Midnight is coming. The camera is watching. And somewhere in this chalet, with its wrong angles and its automatic lock and its terrible hunger for replication, another version of me is probably writing these exact same words, believing just as firmly that he's the real one, that his fear is legitimate, that his confusion is genuine. We're all real, I think. That's the actual horror. Not that the house makes copies, but that every copy is convinced it's the original, that every version has the same memories and the same doubts and the same certainty that the others are the echoes, not them. The lock will release at dawn. One of us will walk out. Maybe all of us will walk out, single file, each convinced we're alone. And out there in the world, we'll spread live lives, make more copies just by existing in proximity to people and places that have learned the house's trick of folding reality. Jasper is staring at the door again. It's 11:59. I can hear Tobias breathing, or someone breathing, or several someones all matched in rhythm. The camera's red light blinks steadily, recording everything, capturing proof that nobody will believe or understand. The clock strikes midnight. New year, new me, new all of us. And somewhere in the walls, I swear I can hear footsteps, coming closer, in perfect sync with mine. Story 9. The desert has a way of swallowing sound. That's the first thing you notice when you kill the engine in a place like this. How the silence doesn't just arrive, it presses down on you, thick and suffocating, like the air itself has weight. My cousin had been driving for 6 hours straight, and when we saw the turnoff marked on the tourist map, neither of us questioned it. A parking area near Widow's Canyon, shaded by ancient cottonwoods, described as a zone of respect and silence. It seemed perfect for what we needed, a place to sleep in the car, rest our eyes, then continue at dawn toward Flagstaff. The gravel crunched under our tires as we pulled into the lot. 3 weathered signs greeted us, their posts leaning at odd angles like drunken sentinels. One displayed a faded map of the area, another showed symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that might have been tribal markings, and the third simply read, Zona de Respeto y Silencio, in peeling paint. Below that, in smaller letters, please honor this sacred space. We'd decided not to hike the trail. The gate across the trailhead bore a rusted chain and a newer laminated sign. Access closed after sunset. Fair enough. We weren't looking for adventure, just a few hours of sleep before tackling the rest of the drive. The parking lot was empty except for us, which felt both fortunate and somehow wrong. Even in the middle of nowhere, you expect to see another soul, another vehicle, some evidence that the world extends beyond your immediate surroundings. The canyon itself loomed in the near distance, a massive wound in the earth that the setting sun painted in shades of rust and shadow. The walls dropped away so steeply that I couldn't see the bottom from where we sat. Somewhere down there, water had carved through millennia of stone, creating something simultaneously beautiful and unsettling. The cottonwoods around the parking area whispered in a breeze I couldn't feel, their leaves producing a sound like distant conversation. My cousin reclined his seat without ceremony, pulled his cap over his eyes, and was asleep within minutes. I envied that ability. I've always been the anxious one, the one who lies awake cataloging every sound, every shift in temperature, every change in the quality of darkness outside the window. The car ticked as the engine cooled. Somewhere in the trees, something rustled. Probably just a bird settling for the night, but my mind immediately conjured larger possibilities. Mountain lion, bear, things with teeth and hunger. I tried to sleep, I really did. But the silence kept evolving, becoming less like absence and more like presence. Have you ever been in a room and suddenly felt certain someone was watching you, even though you were alone? It was like that, except the room was an empty parking lot in the Arizona desert, and the watching feeling came from every direction at once. The canyon, the trees, the darkness beyond our windows, all of it seemed to lean in, attentive and waiting. Around midnight, I gave up and stared at the ceiling of the car, tracing the patterns in the fabric with my eyes. The moon had risen, nearly full, turning everything outside into a composition of silver and black. Shadows from the cottonwood branches moved across the windshield in slow waves, and I watched them the way you might watch flames in a fireplace, letting my mind drift without quite sleeping. That's when the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual. One moment I was comfortable in my jacket, the next, my breath was misting in the air and goosebumps were racing up my arms. My cousin didn't stir, his breathing still deep and even, somehow oblivious to the sudden cold that had turned our car into a refrigerator. I reached for the door lock, an instinctive gesture that I didn't even fully understand in the moment, and my fingers had just touched the button when I saw him. A man stood directly in front of our car. He hadn't walked into view. He was simply there, as if he'd materialized from the moonlight itself. The shock of it froze me completely, my hand still extended toward the lock. My breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. He wore a ranger's uniform, but not the modern kind I'd seen at national parks. This was older, a style I vaguely recognized from old photographs, with a different cut to the jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in complete shadow. He stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then he raised one arm and pointed, not at us, but past us, toward the access road that led back to the highway. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable. "Leave." My cousin jerked awake beside me, startled by my sudden movement as I grabbed his arm. He muttered something confused, rubbing his eyes, and I pointed toward the windshield with a shaking hand. The ranger was still there, his arm still extended, his face still lost in shadow. But now he took a step forward, and another, moving with a strange, gliding quality that made my stomach turn. He approached my cousin's window and raised his other hand, tapping on the glass with one knuckled finger. The sound was wrong. Too loud, too hollow. Like he was knocking on wood instead of glass, or like the glass itself had become something else entirely. My cousin's confusion transformed into alarm. He fumbled with the keys still in the ignition, swearing under his breath, and I couldn't take my eyes off the figure at the window. Details emerged as he leaned closer. The uniform was immaculate but somehow colorless, as if all the pigment had been leached from the fabric. His hands, the ones still tapping on the glass, were pale to the point of translucence. And though his face remained in shadow, I had the overwhelming sense that looking directly at it would be a mistake I couldn't undo. The ranger stopped tapping. He turned his head slightly, and even without seeing his eyes, I knew he was looking at the sign, the one that read, "Access closed." He pointed at it deliberately, then back toward the road, the same gesture repeated with mechanical precision. The message couldn't have been clearer. "You shouldn't be here. Leave now." My cousin needed no further encouragement. The engine roared to life, and I felt him slam the car into reverse. But before we could move, before the wheels could even begin to turn, every single light in the parking area blazed to life simultaneously. The sudden brilliance was blinding. Floodlights mounted on poles I hadn't noticed during daylight erupted with white-hot intensity, turning night into day in the span of a heartbeat. The Ranger was illuminated fully for just an instant, and in that flash I saw his face, or rather, the suggestion of where a face should have been, a blur of features that my eyes refused to process, that slid away from comprehension like water off glass. Then, just as suddenly, the lights died. Not gradually dimming, not flickering out, but extinguishing all at once as if someone had thrown a master switch. The darkness that followed seemed absolute, a black so complete that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The moonlight was gone. The stars were gone. We sat in a void, with only the sound of the engine idling and our own panicked breathing. My cousin didn't wait for his vision to adjust. He gunned the engine and we lurched backward, gravel spraying, the car fishtailing as he fought the wheel. I craned my neck to look through the rear window, expecting to see the Ranger following, but there was nothing, just darkness and the vague shapes of the cottonwoods as they slowly materialized out of the black. We made it to the access road, then to the highway, and we didn't speak for the first 20 miles. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my temples, in my fingertips, in my throat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale hand tapping on the glass, saw the uniform that was somehow both there and not there, saw the face that wasn't quite a face. Finally, my cousin broke the silence with a string of profanities that seemed inadequate for what we'd just experienced. He asked if I'd seen what he'd seen, and I confirmed that yes, I had seen the ranger, the uniform, the lights. He asked if I thought someone was messing with us, some kind of elaborate prank designed to scare away trespassers. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe it desperately. But pranks don't make your skin crawl the way mine was crawling. They don't leave you with the bone-deep certainty that you've brushed up against something fundamentally wrong. We found a gas station as the sun was rising, one of those all-night places that cater to truckers and insomniacs. The coffee was terrible but hot, and the fluorescent lights felt like a blessing after the darkness we'd left behind. My cousin suggested we forget about it, write it off as exhaustion and overactive imaginations, get back on the road and never speak of it again. I nodded, agreed, said all the right things, but I couldn't let it go. While he was in the bathroom, I asked the clerk if she knew anything about Widow's Canyon. She was an older woman with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who's answered 10,000 questions from 10,000 travelers. She told me it was beautiful, but respected by the local tribes as a place of power and memory. People used to die there regularly, she said, before they closed off the dangerous sections and posted proper warnings. Hikers who ignored the signs, climbers who thought they knew better, drunks who wandered off the trail. The canyon had a way of collecting people, she said, and the phrase stuck with me like a burr. I asked if there was a visitor center nearby, somewhere with historical information about the area. She directed me to a small building about 10 miles back the way we'd come, run by the Bureau of Land Management. It wouldn't open until 8, she said, but it was worth the visit if we had time. My cousin objected when I told him where we were going. He wanted distance between us and that parking lot, wanted to pretend the last few hours had never happened. But something in my voice must have convinced him, some edge of desperation or determination, because he sighed and turned the car around without further argument. The visitor center was modest, a single-story structure of wood and glass perched on the rim of a less dramatic canyon, with informational displays and a small gift shop staffed by a young ranger who looked far too awake for 8 in the morning. I wandered through the exhibits while my cousin stayed in the car, too exhausted or too freaked out to join me. The walls were covered with photographs, black and white images of the canyon in different eras, of the people who had explored it, protected it, died in it. I moved along the timeline almost mechanically, my eyes scanning faces and captions without really processing them, until I reached a section dedicated to early rangers and conservation efforts. That's where I found him. The photograph was old, damaged at the edges, the kind of print that's been copied and recopied until it's more grain than image. But the uniform was unmistakable. The same wide-brimmed hat, the same cut of jacket, the same stance, rigid and formal, that belonged to a different era. The caption beneath read, Ranger Elias Thornhill, 1938-1944. Died in a rock slide while escorting visitors away from a closed section of Widow's Canyon. His dedication to protecting others in this sacred landscape is remembered by all who knew him. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I gripped the edge of the display to steady myself, my eyes locked on that grainy face, and even through the decades and the deterioration of the photograph, even through the poor lighting of the visitor center, I recognized him. The shape of the shoulders, the way he held his hand, fingers extended in that same pointing gesture. The angle of his head as he looked toward something beyond the frame. I must have stood there for 10 minutes, maybe longer, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. The young ranger approached and asked if I was all right, her concern genuine, and I heard myself asking about Thornhill, about how he died, about why his photograph was here. She told me the story with the practiced ease of someone who'd recited it many times. Thornhill had been known for his strict enforcement of safety protocols. He'd had no patience for tourists who ignored warnings or trespassed in dangerous areas. In August of 1944, a group of visitors had climbed over the locked gate at Widow's Canyon despite clear closure signs. Thornhill had gone after them alone, determined to bring them back before the afternoon storms rolled in. He'd nearly reached them when the rock face above gave way, triggered by years of erosion and that day's unusual heat. The slide had taken him and buried him under tons of stone. The visitors, ironically, had survived. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you might describe any historical event. But I could barely hear her over the rushing sound in my ears. The canyon had a way of collecting people, the gas station clerk had said. But apparently, it also had a way of keeping them. I thanked the ranger and walked back to the car on legs that felt disconnected from my body. My cousin took one look at my face and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words. How do you explain that the man who'd stood at your window, who'd tapped on your glass with those two pale fingers, who'd warned you away from a place you shouldn't have been, how do you explain that he'd been dead for 80 years? We drove in silence for hours, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own attempts to rationalize the irrational. Exhaustion, he finally said. We'd both been exhausted, probably mildly dehydrated, stressed from the long drive. Our minds had played tricks on us, created a shared hallucination based on that old photograph I'd glimpsed without realizing it when we first pulled in. It was the only logical explanation. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But I keep thinking about those lights, the way they'd all blazed to life in perfect unison, then died just as suddenly. I keep thinking about the cold that had descended on us like a physical presence. I keep thinking about that face that wasn't quite a face, those features that slid away from perception like they existed in some frequency my eyes weren't meant to register. Most of all, I keep thinking about the gesture, that arm extended, pointing us toward safety, toward the road, toward the living world. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at 3 a.m, unable to shake the memory of that night, I wonder what would have happened if we'd ignored him. If we'd stayed in that parking lot, convinced ourselves it was just some random person trying to scare us off, would the rock face above have come loose, just like it did in 1944? Would the canyon have added 2 more names to its collection? And here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. The ranger at the visitor center mentioned that there had been other incidents over the years. Other people who'd reported seeing someone in an old uniform near the closed sections of the canyon. Other people who'd heard tapping on their car windows in the middle of the night. Who'd felt that same bone-deep cold. Who'd been warned away from places they shouldn't have been. She'd said it with a smile, dismissing it as local legend, ghost stories to keep tourists entertained. But her eyes had been serious. She'd believed it, even if she couldn't admit it out loud. Some places remember, she'd said, and some people can't leave, even after they're gone. Their sense of duty keeps them there, keeps them watching, keeps them trying to prevent the same tragedy from repeating. The message was clear, she'd said, echoing what I'd already been thinking. Sometimes a warning is an act of care. Sometimes the dead look out for the living in ways we can't understand. I never went back to Widow's Canyon. I never will. But I drive past it sometimes in my mind, wondering if he's still there, standing in that parking lot, waiting for the next person who doesn't understand that some warnings shouldn't be ignored, that some boundaries exist for reasons that go deeper than we can comprehend. And I wonder if he knows. If some part of Elias Thornhill, trapped between worlds, dedicated beyond death to a duty he couldn't abandon, if he knows that this time, his warning worked. That this time, nobody died on his watch. That 80 years after he was buried under tons of falling stone, he's still protecting people from their own stubborn refusal to listen. I'd like to think it brings him some kind of peace. But something tells me that peace isn't what keeps him there. It's the next person who'll ignore the signs. The next set of headlights in the parking lot. The next stubborn soul who thinks the rules don't apply to them. And the rock face above, patient and eternal, still waiting to fall. Story 10. The old man's breath smelled like cedar bark, and something ancient when he leaned close to tell me about the platform. His eyes, milky with cataracts, seemed to focus on something just past my shoulder as he spoke. "Leave 2 salmon," he said. "Chinook if you can manage it. 9 feet high, end of the Whisper Creek Trail. Just courtesy," he added, as if that explained everything. I'd been guiding fishing trips in the Cascades for 3 seasons, and every week brought some new superstition from the locals. Don't whistle after dark. Never count your catch before you dock. Leave tobacco at the trailhead. Folklore, all of it. The kind of stories people tell to make wilderness feel less indifferent. But this old man, who'd shown up at my cabin without introduction or appointment, had the kind of certainty in his voice that made my stomach tighten. The platform stood exactly where he said it would, wedged between 2 Douglas firs at the trail's terminus. Someone had built it from weathered planks, the wood silvered with age, lashed together with rope that looked hand-braided. The structure seemed organic somehow, as if it had grown there rather than been constructed. At 9 feet, it sat just high enough that I had to stretch to place the salmon on its surface, my fingertips barely reaching. The fish were fresh from that morning's catch, their scales still holding that deep silver-green sheen that only wild Chinook possess. I left them there as the September sun filtered through the canopy, casting everything in that golden-green light particular to Oregon forests. The trees pressed close on all sides, their trunks massive and dark, bark deeply furrowed. Moss hung in thick curtains from the branches. Everything smelled of Douglas fir needles and decay, that sweet rot of the forest floor, where nothing ever truly dies but merely transforms. Walking back, I felt the weight of the woods differently. The usual sounds, chickadees in the understory, the distant percussion of a pileated woodpecker, seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. My boots crunched on the trail, each footfall somehow too loud. Twice I stopped and turned, certain I'd heard something following, but saw only the cathedral quiet of old-growth timber receding behind me. That night, sleep came in fragments. My cabin sat in a small clearing 2 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by forest that had never been logged. I'd always found the isolation peaceful before, the kind of solitude that lets you hear your own thoughts. But that night, every settling timber in the cabin walls made me open my eyes. The darkness beyond the windows seemed to press against the glass, patient and attentive. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of wood splintering. It wasn't close, but it was loud, the sharp crack of a substantial tree limb giving way, followed by the groan of stressed timber. Then another crack, and another. Something massive was moving through the forest with the kind of deliberate progress that speaks of intelligence and purpose. Between the breaking branches came a sound like heavy fabric being dragged across rough ground, a sustained scraping that set my teeth on edge. I kept a night vision monocular for spotting nocturnal wildlife. Black bears were common, and the occasional cougar. My hands shook as I fumbled it from the bedside table and moved to the window. The device transformed darkness into that eerie green world, everything rendered in shades of phosphorescence. I scanned the tree line, my breath fogging the cold glass. At first I saw nothing, then movement. Not in the underbrush where an animal would be, but higher, much higher. A shadow detached itself from the greater darkness between 2 massive firs, and my rational mind struggled to assign it scale. It had to be close to the cabin for me to see it at all, which meant it stood at least 9 or 10 feet tall, perhaps more. The form was roughly humanoid, but wrong in proportions I couldn't quite identify through the monocular's limited field of view. The way it moved suggested joints that bent at angles human anatomy wouldn't allow. It stood at the edge of the clearing for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, with movements that seemed both ponderous and impossibly fluid, it turned and retreated into the forest. The sound of snapping branches receded, growing fainter until only the whisper of wind through pine needles remained. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee that had gone cold, watching the windows lighten from black to gray to the pale gold of dawn. Every shadow seemed to hold the echo of that silhouette. My rational mind offered explanations. A bear standing upright, an elk, some trick of perspective and exhaustion, but none of them fit what I'd seen. Bears don't move like that. Nothing I knew moved like that. Sunlight made everything seem absurd. In the clarity of morning, I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed it. That 3 a.m. anxiety had conjured something from nothing. I made breakfast I couldn't eat and prepared for the day's guiding trip, going through the motions with mechanical precision. But before my clients arrived, I found myself walking back toward the platform, drawn by a compulsion I didn't want to examine. The salmon were gone. That by itself meant nothing. Ravens could have taken them. So could a bear, a cougar, even an especially bold coyote. But there was no blood. No scales scattered on the platform's surface. No bones or scraps of flesh caught in the wood grain. The planks were clean, as if the fish had simply been lifted away whole. On the ground below, the forest floor's carpet of needles showed no disturbance. No tracks, no matted vegetation, nothing to indicate any animal had been there, except for the handprint. It marked the mud near the platform's base, clear and deep. My own hand, when I held it up for comparison, looked small and delicate by contrast. The print showed 4 fingers spread wide, each digit thick and long. The thumb offset at an angle greater than human anatomy allows, articulated in a way that suggested it could oppose from multiple directions. The depth of the impression in the mud spoke to immense weight, something pressing down with far more force than any human could manage. I photographed it with my phone, the images rendering the print in harsh digital clarity. Later, staring at those photos, I would try to convince myself they showed nothing unusual, that perspective and shadow had distorted an ordinary track. But I knew better. I'd spent years reading sign in these forests. I knew what bear tracks looked like, what human prints showed. This was neither. The old man appeared at my cabin 3 days later, materializing from the tree line as if he'd been waiting there. When I asked how he knew I'd left the offering, his rheumy eyes fixed on something past my left shoulder, and he asked a question instead of answering. "You thanked it, didn't you?" "The courtesy requires thanks." I hadn't. The thought had never occurred to me. His expression, when I told him this, showed something between disappointment and genuine concern. He didn't elaborate. He simply turned and walked back into the forest, moving with the slow certainty of someone who knew these woods better than the trees themselves. That night I lay in bed trying to calculate the physics of it. 9 feet to reach the platform. Whatever I'd seen had extended its arm upward without jumping or climbing, just reaching. Simple extension, which meant its standing height, arm at rest, must have been close to 7 feet, possibly more. And the handprint suggested fingers longer than any human's, which meant greater reach. Every calculation led to the same impossible conclusion. The stacking started a week later. I woke one morning to find stones piled on my deck. River rocks, water smoothed and heavy, arranged in a cairn that stood exactly 9 feet tall. I measured it 3 times to be certain. The stones decreased in size from bottom to top, each one placed with such precision that the structure needed no mortar or binding. It simply stood there, impossible and deliberate, a message in stone that I couldn't ignore. I dismantled it, hurling the rocks into the woods with more force than necessary, breathing hard and sweating despite the morning chill. The physical labor felt good, a way to channel the anxiety that had been building since that night with the monocular. By the time my first clients arrived for their morning trip, the deck stood empty again. The cairn was rebuilt by the next morning. Same height, same precise construction. This time I photographed it before taking it apart, documenting each stone's placement, looking for evidence of human construction, tool marks, anything that would prove someone was messing with me. The rocks showed nothing but the patient work of water over decades. I stopped dismantling them after the 3rd rebuilding. The message had become clear enough. Something wanted me to remember the height, to understand the connection between platform and offering and debt. The courtesy, the old man had called it. But courtesies run both ways, and I'd taken something without reciprocation. My guiding work suffered. Clients noticed my distraction, the way I'd stop mid-instruction to scan the tree line, certain I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision. At night, I began keeping the monocular on my bedside table, checking the woods at irregular intervals. Most nights I saw nothing unusual. The ordinary nighttime business of the forest, deer browsing in the clearing, once a great horned owl perched in the near fir, its eyes reflecting back at me like coins. But 3 times I saw the silhouette again, never close enough for detail, always at the tree line, standing motionless for spans of time no natural creature would maintain. watching, waiting. On the third sighting, I worked up the courage to grab a flashlight and step onto the deck, swinging the beam toward where I'd seen the shape. The light showed nothing but trees and darkness, yet I felt certain that something had only just stepped back, moving the instant before illumination could catch it. The forest began to feel different on my daily walks to check the platform. Sounds didn't carry the way they should. Birdsong would cut off too abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. I'd find trees with bark scraped away at heights I couldn't reach, long vertical gouges that showed pale wood underneath. Once, I discovered a cedar that had been pushed over, not blown down by wind, but deliberately toppled, its root ball torn from the earth with such force that soil still hung in clods from the exposed roots. The old man appeared twice more, each time materializing from the forest without warning, each time asking if I'd made things right. "The courtesy requires reciprocity," he'd say, and I'd ask what he meant, what I was supposed to do. His answer was always the same: "You know what you took. You know what to give." But I didn't know. That was the problem that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through possibilities. The fish? I could leave more fish, but fish weren't personal, weren't mine in any meaningful sense. I caught them for clients, for pay. They cost me nothing but time and skill. Sleep became an enemy I fought and lost most nights. When exhaustion finally dragged me under, dreams came in fragments. Vast shapes moving through darkness, hands that reached and grasped, the sound of breaking timber that might have been laughter or might have been warning. I'd wake with my heart hammering, uncertain whether the sounds I'd heard were real or imagined, whether the scraping on the cabin's exterior walls was wind-blown branches or something else. The cairns multiplied. I'd find them in places I'd walked the day before, impossible towers of stone balanced in clearings, arranged at trail junctions, standing sentinel at the edges of streams. All of them 9 feet tall, all of them precisely constructed. I documented them obsessively, taking photographs from every angle, trying to find evidence of human intervention, and finding nothing that satisfied rational explanation. My rational mind began suggesting things I didn't want to consider. Stress can cause hallucinations. Isolation breeds delusion. There's a reason people go strange when they spend too much time alone in the wilderness. The human brain requires social feedback to maintain its grip on consensus reality. Without other people to confirm what you're seeing, how do you know your perceptions are accurate? I started marking time by the cairns, checking them daily, noting which ones remained and which had been dismantled by weather or wildlife or whatever force had built them. They became waypoints in my deteriorating certainty, solid and undeniable even as everything else began to feel questionable. My clients reported me acting strangely, stopping mid-sentence, staring into empty forest, asking if they'd heard sounds that apparently only I could detect. The worst part was the watching. I felt it constantly now, even during daylight hours when rational creatures slept or foraged far from human presence. Eyes on me while I worked. Attention focused with the intensity of a predator tracking prey. Sometimes I'd turn quickly, trying to catch whatever it was, but I saw only forest, trees and ferns, and the eternal twilight beneath the canopy. I considered leaving. Packing my essential belongings into the truck and driving until the mountains fell away behind me, until I reached somewhere flat and treeless where nothing could watch from the shadows. But something stopped me every time. Pride, maybe, or the stubborn certainty that running would constitute an admission I wasn't ready to make. The old man appeared one final time on a morning when frost silvered the ground and my breath made ghosts in the air. He looked older than before, if that were possible, his skin papery and translucent. He asked his question, "Have you made it right?" And I demanded answers. What did it want? How was I supposed to reciprocate? What was the courtesy? He studied me for a long moment, those cataract-clouded eyes finally seeming to focus on my face rather than the space beyond my shoulder. Then he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of something long practiced, perhaps long rehearsed. "You leave things for the forest leaves things for you. That's the courtesy. You understand what you see there, the truth of what's watching. Most people never get that gift. Most people never have to know what's really between the trees. But you looked, you saw, and now it knows you know. His words settled into my chest like stones, cold and heavy. The gift of knowing, the burden of sight. He turned to leave but paused at the clearing's edge, half swallowed by shadow. "One more thing," he said. "Don't try to leave. It won't follow you. It doesn't need to. Once you've seen it, you carry it with you. Everywhere you go, you'll wonder if the shadows are deep enough, if the spaces between buildings hold the same presence as the spaces between trees. The forest taught you to see. You can't unlearn that." Then he was gone, and I was alone in the clearing with frost melting under the climbing sun. That night, I didn't use the monocular. I sat in darkness at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold hours ago, and listened to the forest. Breaking branches, the sustained scrape of something heavy being dragged. Sounds that should have terrified me but had instead become almost familiar. A dark lullaby that marked the passage of hours. At some point I stood and walked to the window. Even without the monocular, I could see it there at the tree line, a darker shape within darkness, massive and patient. We regarded each other across the clearing, and I understood with crystalline clarity that it had always been there, before the salmon, before the platform, before I'd chosen to guide these particular mountains. It had been there in the spaces between trees, watching everyone who moved through its territory, simply waiting to be noticed. The courtesy wasn't about offerings or reciprocity. It was about acknowledgement, about the moment when you stop pretending that wilderness is empty, that shadows are just absence of light, that the sounds in the night have simple explanations. I raised my hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or surrender or simple recognition. The shape didn't move, but something in its stillness changed, became more attentive, as if it had been waiting for precisely this moment. In the morning, I would find another cairn on my deck, 9 feet tall and perfectly balanced. But for now, I simply stood at the window and watched the darkness watching me back, and wondered if I had ever really been alone in these mountains, or if the solitude I'd treasured had always been an illusion, a comfort story told to creatures who needed to believe they were the only things looking out from behind eyes. The tea in my mug had gone cold completely, and somewhere in the forest, something large moved between the trees with purpose and grace, and I understood that courtesy, like debt, has no final accounting. Only the endless exchange between seeing and being seen, knowing and being known, watching and being watched in the deep places where the light doesn't reach, and the old things remember when the mountains were young and humans were just another visitor in their vast, patient territory. Story 11. The realtor's sedan kicked up dust as it disappeared down the mountain road, leaving me alone with the A-frame for the first time in 23 years. The house looked smaller than I remembered, hunched between the pines like something trying to hide. Afternoon light slanted through the trees, turning the windows into mirrors that reflected nothing but branches and sky. I stood on the gravel driveway, keys heavy in my pocket, and listened to the mountain silence, that particular thickness of quiet that comes from elevation and isolation, where sound seems to get absorbed by the trees before it can travel far. A breeze moved through the pines, making that oceanic whisper I'd heard every night as a kid, lying in bed with my eyes open, waiting for the footsteps to start. The house key turned smoothly in the lock. Someone had maintained the place over the years, kept it from falling into complete decay, though the realtor had been vague about who. Estate management, he'd said, waving his hand dismissively when I pressed. The previous owners hadn't lived here long. None of them had. Inside, the air smelled of pine resin, and something earthier, damper, like the bottom of a forest where mushrooms pushed through layers of needles. Dust motes drifted in the light streaming through the tall windows that formed the A-frame's front wall. The open floor plan meant I could see from the entry all the way through to the deck beyond, where the forest pressed close. The furniture was gone, but the bones of the place remained unchanged. The stone fireplace, the loft bedroom accessed by a ship's ladder, the kitchen tucked under the loft's overhang, and below everything beneath my feet, the sealed basement. The realtor had been careful when discussing it. There was an agreement, he'd explained, made years ago by the estate and the county. Something about structural concerns and liability. The basement had been sealed properly, professionally, and it was better to leave it that way. When I'd asked what properly meant, he'd gotten that look people get when they're reciting memorized phrases. Poured concrete, reinforced, no longer accessible, really nothing down there anyway. But I'd seen what was down there. I'd been 13 years old, flashlight in hand, standing among the sculptor's abandoned works. My mother had taken me down there exactly once, 2 months after we'd moved in. She'd been looking for the breaker box during a storm. The basement was unfinished then, just concrete walls and exposed joists overhead, and crammed into every available space were the sculptor's pieces. Human faces, dozens of them, cast in plaster and clay and something that might have been wax. They lined crude shelves built into the walls, sat on workbenches, hung from hooks in the ceiling joists like grotesque ornaments. Every single one was missing its mouth. Not carved away or broken off. The faces simply ended where the mouth should begin, smooth and uninterrupted, as if the sculptor had never conceived of that feature at all. The expressions were otherwise remarkably detailed, creases around eyes suggesting laughter or sorrow, furrowed brows indicating concentration, the slight flare of nostrils caught mid-breath. But where the mouth should have opened, there was only blank surface, sometimes slightly concave, as if the absent mouth had left a depression in the surrounding flesh. My mother had found the breaker box and herded me back upstairs quickly, and we'd never discussed what we'd seen. 2 weeks later, she'd had someone come and seal the basement door, just temporarily, she'd said, until we could get someone to clean it out properly. But we never did. And 3 months after that, we moved away entirely, leaving the house to sit empty while lawyers sorted through the sculptor's abandoned estate. I'd been hearing the footsteps for a month by then. Now, standing in the empty house, I could feel the basement's presence like a cold spot beneath the floorboards. The entrance had been in the kitchen, a door that opened onto descending stairs. When I walked to where it should be, I found instead a section of wall that looked newer than the rest, the drywall slightly different in texture and color despite someone's attempt to match it. I pressed my palm against it. The surface was cool and slightly damp, as if condensation had formed on the other side and was seeping through. My hand came away with a faint residue that smelled of earth and something mineral, like wet stone. That night, I slept in a camping bag on the floor of the loft bedroom, the one with the glass door that led to the deck. I'd brought a camp light that threw harsh shadows across the angled ceiling. Outside, the forest was a wall of darkness, broken only by the occasional shift of branches in the wind. I lay awake, listening. The footsteps began at 2:47 a.m. They came from below, climbing the exterior stairs that led to the deck, each impact deliberate and measured. 1, 2, 3 steps, then silence, then descending. 3, 2, 1. A pause that stretched for exactly 30 seconds. I counted, and then the sequence repeated. My body remembered this rhythm before my mind fully registered it. The same pattern from 23 years ago, unchanged, as if time had folded and I was 13 again, lying in this same room, too frightened to move. I got up. The camping bag's zipper seemed thunderous in the silence. I crossed to the glass door and stood there, breath fogging the pane, watching the deck. Nothing moved in the moonlight that filtered through the pines. The deck boards were empty, unmarked by shadow or presence. But the footsteps continued, rising and falling, a rhythm without a source. I unlocked the door and slid it open. The sound stopped instantly. The night air rushed in, pine-scented and cold enough to make my breath catch. I stepped onto the deck. The wood felt solid under my bare feet, real and present. I walked to the railing and looked down at the stairs descending into darkness. The third step from the top glistened as if wet. I went back inside and closed the door, but I couldn't lock it. My hands shook too much to work the mechanism, so I wedged a chair under the handle instead and returned to my camping bag, where I lay with my eyes open until dawn. In the morning, I examined the deck stairs in full daylight. The third step was dry, the wood weathered but solid. No sign of moisture, no footprints. Nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there, but when I climbed to that step and stood on it, the wood creaked under my weight with a sound I recognized, the exact tone that had punctuated each ascending footfall the night before. I spent the day exploring the property, trying to ground myself in the mundane work of inspection and planning. The well pump still functioned. The roof needed minor repairs. The deck boards were mostly sound but would need treating. I made lists, took measurements, did everything I could to avoid thinking about the wall in the kitchen or the rhythm of phantom footsteps. As the sun lowered, painting the pines in amber light, I found myself standing in front of that wall again. I'd brought tools this time: a hammer, a pry bar, a utility knife. The realtor's words echoed in my head: structural concerns, liability, better left sealed, but they felt hollow, like a story everyone agreed to tell without quite believing it. I scored the drywall with the knife, then used the hammer's claw to punch through. The surface gave way easier than expected, crumbling into chunks of old plaster and drywall compound. Behind it, I found not poured concrete as the realtor had promised, but brick, old brick, the kind that predated the house itself, mortared in patterns that spoke of hasty work. The smell hit me as I widened the hole. Damp earth, yes, but also something sharper, almost metallic. Not blood. I knew that smell from accidents and injuries, but something that reminded me of old coins, tarnished and handled by too many fingers. I pulled away more drywall. The bricks continued, a wall within the wall, and now I could see that the mortar between them was marked with shapes. Not random trowel strokes, but deliberate patterns, spirals, crosses, symbols that might have been letters from alphabets I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. A text from the realtor. Just checking in. Hope you're settling in well. Remember, if you need anything, I'm just a call away. I stared at the message, then at the wall I'd partially demolished. If I needed anything. What I needed was to know why someone had gone to such lengths to seal away a basement full of mouthless sculptures. What I needed was to understand why the footsteps had resumed the very first night I'd returned. What I needed was to go down there. I worked through the afternoon, pulling away the drywall, and then, with more difficulty, chiseling through the brick. The mortar was old, but had been mixed with something that made it harder than normal, more like stone than clay. Each brick I removed revealed another, until I began to wonder if the entire space had been filled in. If there was no basement anymore at all, just solid mass where one had been. Then my pry bar punched through into empty space. Cold air breathed out from the hole, carrying that earth and metal smell so strongly I had to step back. I widened the opening, pulling away bricks until I'd created a gap large enough to climb through. Beyond it, my flashlight beam revealed stairs descending into darkness. The basement hadn't been filled in. It had been sealed off, the stairs intact, leading down into a space that my light couldn't fully penetrate. And from that darkness came a sound I hadn't heard in 23 years, but recognized instantly. A soft, rhythmic whisper, like many people trying to speak at once without the ability to form words. I should have stopped there. Every instinct screamed at me to replace the bricks, to call the realtor and say I'd changed my mind, to drive back down the mountain and never return. But that sound, that terrible, wordless whisper, was the same one I'd convinced myself I'd imagined as a 13-year-old, lying in bed while footsteps measured out their endless rhythm on the stairs outside. I'd spent 23 years telling myself it had been wind in the trees, the house settling, my adolescent imagination running wild in a creepy new place. But some part of me had always known the truth. I'd heard something real, and I'd run from it, and it had been waiting here all this time. I climbed through the hole. The stairs were steeper than I remembered, or perhaps I was simply taller now. The wood groaned under my weight, and the whispering sound intensified, a chorus of voices that rose and fell like breathing. My flashlight beam swept across the basement's walls, and I saw that they were covered, absolutely covered in handprints. Small handprints, like those I'd found on the inside of my glass door 23 years ago, but hundreds of them, thousands, overlapping and spiraling across every surface in patterns that made my eyes hurt to follow. The prints looked pressed into the concrete itself, as if the hands had been sinking into wet cement, And around each one, the surface was rough, granular, like the texture of cast plaster. The sculptures were still here. They filled the basement just as they had in my memory, those mouthless faces staring from every shelf and surface, their expressions frozen in whatever emotion the sculptor had captured. But now I could see what I'd missed as a frightened adolescent. The faces were all unique, highly detailed, remarkably individualized. Different ages, different bone structures, different states of emotion. Not generic faces cast from a standard mold, but specific people, captured with the kind of precision that spoke of working from life models who had posed without mouths, or who had lost them somehow, or who had. The whispering crescendoed, and I realized it was coming from the faces themselves, not from hidden speakers or some trick of acoustics, but from those smooth, blank spaces where mouths should have been, as if the air itself was vibrating in sympathy with shapes that existed just beyond perception. In the center of the basement stood a workbench, and on it, fresh plaster still wet and gleaming in my flashlight beam, was a new sculpture. My own face stared back at me, captured in exquisite detail. Every line, every pore, the particular way my left eyebrow arched higher than my right, the small scar on my cheekbone from a childhood fall. The expression was one I recognized from mirrors and photographs, a look of concentration tinged with unease. The face I made when I was trying to understand something that frightened me. The sculpture had no mouth. I touched my own lips, feeling their reality, their solidity. They were there. Of course they were there. I could feel them, could run my tongue across my teeth, could taste the fear-sour coating on my tongue. But the sculpture suggested otherwise, suggested that this was simply how I looked, how I'd always looked, how everyone in this place had always looked. The whispering reached a fever pitch, and I understood suddenly that it wasn't trying to speak. It was trying to teach me something, how to communicate without the crude mechanism of mouths, without the violence of teeth and tongue and breath. The faces were trying to show me their perfect silence, their pure expression unmarred by the messiness of speech. I backed toward the stairs, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. The handprints on the walls seemed to move in the shifting light, pressing outward as if something on the other side was trying to push through. The faces tracked my movement with empty sockets and missing mouths, and I realized they weren't sculptures at all, or weren't just sculptures, but something caught between states, trapped in plaster like insects in amber, preserved at the moment of transformation. My foot hit the bottom stair, and I ran. I burst through the hole in the kitchen wall and didn't stop until I was outside on the deck, gulping pine-scented air and trying to convince myself that I still had a mouth, that I could still scream if I needed to. But even as I stood there, I felt my lips tingling, a numbness spreading across the lower half of my face. I touched my chin, and my fingers came away dusted with something white and fine, like plaster dust, though I hadn't touched the sculpture. That was 3 days ago. I'm still in the house. I haven't sealed the basement again, haven't even covered the hole in the wall. Each night the footsteps climb to the third stair, and each night I stand at the glass door and watch nothing move on the deck beyond. The whispering continues in the basement, rising and falling like tides, and sometimes I think I can almost understand what it's trying to say. The numbness has spread. My lips feel thick and clumsy when I try to speak, though words still form. I can hear them, even if they sound muffled and strange, as if coming from a great distance. I've tried calling the realtor, but my voice comes out slurred, incomprehensible, and he only says he can't understand me and I should text if something's wrong. But when I look in the mirror, my mouth is still there. I can see it clearly, can watch it move as I try to form words. The reflection shows me speaking, shows my lips and teeth and tongue doing their work, even as the sounds that emerge become increasingly garbled and unclear. Unless, of course, the reflection is wrong. Unless what I'm seeing is simply what I expect to see, what I've been conditioned to believe I should see. While the truth, the real truth, is down in the basement, captured in wet plaster, showing me exactly what I've become. This morning, I found new handprints on the inside of the glass door, small and desperate and multiplying, and they're appearing even as I watch, pressing through from some space that exists parallel to this one, or perhaps from a time that hasn't quite finished happening, a loop that's been running for 23 years or longer since the sculptor first began his work. Tonight, I think I'll go back down to the basement. Not because I want to, but because I can feel it pulling me. That space below the house calling to something in me that's been waiting to respond since I was 13 years old, standing in that same room, looking at faces that couldn't scream. I need to understand what they're trying to say without mouths. I need to learn their language. And as the sun sets behind the pines and the shadows grow long across the deck, as my reflection in the glass begins to look less and less like something I recognize, I find myself wondering if the sculptor ever left at all, or if he's still down there, still working, adding face after face to his collection of the mouthless, waiting patiently for each resident to finally understand that speech is just another form of sealing, that words are simply elaborate ways of saying nothing at all. The footsteps will start soon. I'll count them, like always. 1, 2, 3. And this time, I think I'll open the door. Story 12. The first time I saw him, he was just a silhouette against the dying light. We had pitched our tents in a clearing half a mile from the main trail, the kind of spot that feels like a secret, dense pine walls on 3 sides, the distant rush of the Atlantic beyond the 4th. October in Acadia means the tourists have mostly gone, leaving the park to serious hikers and people like us. 3 colleagues from the geology department looking to escape the suffocating fluorescence of the university for a few days. The air carried that particular coastal Maine scent of salt and decomposing pine needles, sharp enough to taste. I was tending the fire when he passed the first time. Just a figure moving along the trail we'd crossed earlier, maybe 30 yards from our camp. He didn't look our way. The light was too poor to make out features, only the outline of someone walking with an odd, measured pace, like he was counting steps. My colleague from the tent across from mine, a sedimentologist who'd spent 6 months in Antarctica and claimed nothing rattled him anymore, glanced up from his book and watched the figure disappear into the trees. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. 20 minutes later, the same silhouette passed again, heading back the way he'd come. Same deliberate pace, same rigid posture. This time I felt the weight of attention, though his head never turned. The feeling crawled up my spine like something alive, raising the fine hairs at the base of my skull. I told myself it was just another hiker finishing an evening loop, but the rational explanation felt thin, unconvincing even to my own mind. Then he stopped. Just stopped, maybe 20 feet from the trail's edge, facing our camp. The firelight didn't reach him. He stood just beyond its radius, a darker shape against the darkness. I could feel his eyes on us, though I couldn't see them. The woods had gone quiet. Even the wind had stilled, leaving only the fires crackling and my own pulse thudding in my ears. My friend across the fire cleared his throat, a nervous sound he tried to disguise as casual. We didn't speak. Speaking would have acknowledged what we were seeing, would have made it real. Instead, we pretended to be occupied with our tasks, adjusting logs, checking tent stakes, anything to avoid looking directly at the figure that had become the center of our awareness. He stood there for what might have been 3 minutes or 30. Time acquired a strange quality, elastic and unreliable. When I finally risked a direct look, he was gone. No sound of footsteps, no rustling branches. Just gone, as if the darkness had simply absorbed him. We stayed up late that night, feeding the fire past any reasonable hour, none of us willing to voice what we were thinking. The woods pressed close around us, full of small sounds that seemed to carry meaning just beyond comprehension. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through pine needles felt deliberate, purposeful. The third member of our group, a petrology specialist who normally slept like the dead, emerged from her tent around 3 in the morning. I was still awake, watching the fire burn down to coals, unable to shake the feeling that we were being observed from just beyond the light's reach. She needed to use the bathroom. There was a composting toilet maybe 300 feet down a side trail. one of those Park Service installations that tries and fails to blend into the natural environment. I told her to take the flashlight, to stay on the trail, to call out if she needed anything. She nodded, her face pale in the dim glow of the dying fire, and disappeared into the darkness. She was gone for 9 minutes. I know because I counted, watching the second hand on my watch perform its circular march, while the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. The night seemed to be holding its breath. When she returned, she wasn't running, but her walk had a barely controlled quality, like someone forcing themselves not to bolt. Her face had gone beyond pale to a waxy, bloodless shade that made her look carved from soap. She didn't speak, just gestured back toward the toilet trail with a trembling hand. It took 3 attempts for her to get the words out, her voice coming in a raspy whisper that barely qualified as sound. He was there, the man from the trail, standing between 2 pines, maybe 10 feet from the toilet, not moving, not blinking, just standing there, staring at her. Close enough that she could see he wasn't dressed for the cold, just a thin flannel shirt and worn jeans, no jacket despite the temperature hovering around 40 degrees. Close enough to see that his face was perfectly still, no breath misting in the frigid air, no natural fidgeting or shifting of weight. 3 meters, she kept repeating. 3 meters. That's all that separated them. We broke camp in darkness. There's a particular kind of panic that comes with trying to pack efficiently while every shadow might contain a watching figure. Every sound might be approaching footsteps. We threw gear into bags without bothering to organize it, collapsed tents with poles still extended, moved with a desperate, silent coordination born from shared terror. My hands shook so badly, I could barely zip the tent bag. The walk back to the car felt eternal. Our flashlight beams jumped and skittered across the trail, creating more shadows than they dispelled. Every tree trunk became a potential silhouette, every gap between branches a possible vantage point. We didn't see him again, but the feeling of being watched never left, a constant pressure between my shoulder blades. We drove to a small coastal town an hour south, found an all-night diner, and sat in a booth drinking coffee until the sun came up. None of us slept. We didn't talk about what happened, operating instead in a collective state of denial, as if silence could unmake the experience. The fluorescent lights and formica tables and the clink of dishes from the kitchen felt almost aggressively normal, a desperate assertion of the mundane against the memory of that still figure in the darkness. By mid-morning, exhaustion and daylight had dulled the sharp edge of fear. We agreed, without quite saying so, to salvage something from the trip. There was a lighthouse about 20 miles up the coast, one of those picturesque main landmarks that appears in 1,000 tourist photographs. We'd planned to visit it anyway. The day was bright and cold, the kind of crystalline autumn weather that makes everything seem sharply defined and rational. The lighthouse sat on a rocky promontory, white paint gleaming against the blue sky and bluer ocean. A parking lot, a visitor center, a well-maintained trail spiraling up to the tower. Families wandered around with cameras. A tour group clustered near the base, listening to a guide explain the history. Everything orderly, regulated, safe. We started up the spiral stairs inside the tower. The walls were thick stone, cool to the touch, the steps worn smooth by decades of visitors. My legs ached from lack of sleep and the previous night's panicked hike. But the climb felt good, purposeful. A simple physical task that demanded nothing beyond putting one foot in front of the other. We were maybe 2/3 of the way up when we met him coming down. He was clean this time. Hair combed back, face freshly shaved. Wearing expensive hiking clothes, the kind of technical gear that costs more than my monthly car payment. His boots were pristine, laces tied in perfect bows. He looked like he'd stepped out of an outdoor equipment catalog. But it was him. Same height, same build, same strange stillness in the way he moved, same face. Though now I could see it clearly in the bright light filtering through the narrow windows. Sharp features, dark eyes, a face that might have been handsome if it weren't for something fundamentally wrong in its proportions. Some subtle misalignment that my brain couldn't quite identify, but recoiled from instinctively. He smiled as he approached. a careful arrangement of lips and teeth that never reached his eyes. We pressed ourselves against the curved wall to let him pass on the narrow stairs. He moved slowly, deliberately, maintaining eye contact with each of us in turn. When he reached my position, he stopped, stood there, one step above me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that didn't mask an underlying scent of salt water and decay. His voice was soft, almost gentle, carrying an accent I couldn't place. The words came out precisely formed, over-enunciated, like someone speaking a memorized phrase. "You climbed faster this time," he said. Then he continued down the stairs, his footsteps making no sound on the stone. We stood frozen for a long moment, the three of us, not looking at each other. Below, I could hear the tour group's laughter, the guide's voice explaining something about the lighthouse keeper's quarters. Normal sounds. Human sounds. They seemed to be coming from a different world. We didn't finish the climb. We went back down, quickly but not running, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. He wasn't in the tower. We searched with our eyes, trying to be subtle, but he wasn't among the tourists, wasn't in the visitor center, wasn't anywhere we could see. My colleague suggested, with the kind of forced rationality that sounds hollow even to the speaker, that maybe it was someone who looked similar. A coincidence. Acadia wasn't that large. Running into the same hiker wouldn't be impossible. But the clothes, the transformation, the comment about climbing faster, we reported it to a park ranger before leaving, keeping our description vague, trying not to sound hysterical. The ranger was polite but skeptical, clearly dealing with city people spooked by the woods. He took notes, promised to check on the campsite, asked if we wanted to file a formal complaint. We didn't. What would we say? That a man stood near our camp and appeared on some stairs? Later, as we packed our gear into the car, my friend from across the fire told us about the visitor center. She'd gone to the bathroom while we talked to the ranger and wandered through a small historical exhibit on her way back. There were photographs on the wall, black and white images from the lighthouse's past, keepers and their families, Coast Guard crews, visiting dignitaries. One photo, she said, was from 1978, a group of tourists with a guide. The guide wore a flannel shirt and worn jeans. He had sharp features and dark eyes and stood with a particular rigid posture. He was identical to the man who'd watched our camp, the man on the stairs. According to the caption, he'd disappeared during a winter storm that same year. His body was never found. The lighthouse was automated shortly after. I didn't go back to see the photograph. I'm not sure I believe her. Trauma and exhaustion can play tricks on the mind, create connections that don't exist, find patterns in randomness. Maybe she misremembered, or the similarity was superficial, or the photo was of someone else entirely. But sometimes, late at night, I think about his words on the stairs. This time, not today or now. This time, as if there had been other times, as if there would be more. I think about the lighthouse standing on its promontory, light sweeping across the same rocks, the same sea, night after night, year after year, an endless rotation, a loop. I think about the campsite in the woods, about hikers who might pitch their tents in that clearing, about fires they might build against the darkness, about a figure that might pass on the trail, once, twice, then stop and stare. I think about stairs spiraling upward in a tower, about climbers meeting someone on their way down, about words that suggest history repeating itself. I wonder if he's waiting, if somewhere in the woods near Acadia, or in the lighthouse tower, or in the space between attempts, he stands patient and still, watching for whoever comes next, watching for the ones who don't run fast enough, who don't leave quickly enough, who stop and stare back instead of fleeing. The rational part of my brain insists there's an explanation. Coincidence, misidentification, the power of suggestion amplifying a random encounter into something sinister. Maybe he was just a strange man with poor social boundaries. Maybe the photo showed someone who simply resembled him. Maybe we were tired and scared, and our minds filled in the gaps with nightmare logic. But that's not the part of my brain I listen to anymore. Because sometimes, on the edge of sleep, I can feel it again. That weight of attention, That sense of being observed by something that doesn't blink, that doesn't breathe, that stands at the border of firelight and waits. I can hear his voice, soft and precise, speaking words that suggest this has all happened before and will happen again. You climbed faster this time. Not fast enough, apparently, because I'm still here, still thinking about it, still unable to shake the feeling that something in those Maine woods, or in that lighthouse, or in the space where past and present blur together, is waiting for us to come back, waiting for us to slow down, waiting for the moment we don't run. Story 13. The branch snapped at 1:07 a.m. I know the exact time because I just checked my watch. The luminous hands glowing faint green in the darkness between the staff cabins and the lake. Third night of my rotation doing security rounds, and I'd fallen into the rhythm of it. Flashlight off to preserve night vision, boots finding the familiar dirt path by memory and moonlight, the August air thick with pine resin, and that peculiar Adirondack dampness that never quite leaves your lungs. The crack came from directly above me, loud enough that I felt it in my chest. Not the dry snap of dead wood, but the wet, fibrous tear of something living giving way under impossible weight. I froze, hand instinctively reaching for the flare gun on my hip. Standard equipment out here, where cell service died 2 miles back, and the nearest ranger station sat 30 minutes away by truck. Then the impact. The ground shuddered beneath my feet. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, but enough that I felt it through the soles of my boots, a deep percussion that traveled up through my ankles and knees. Something massive had just hit the earth maybe 20 feet ahead, in the darkness between the path and the tree line. I stood perfectly still, flashlight still holstered, listening. 2 beats of silence. Then footsteps. Not the 4-legged lope of a bear or the skittering scramble of a raccoon. 2-footed, heavy, moving upslope away from me with a gait that sounded almost human but wrong. Too fast, too purposeful, each impact thudding against the earth with weight that suggested something far larger than any person I'd ever known. The steps crashed through the underbrush for perhaps 6 seconds, then stopped. My hand was shaking when I finally pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and I swept it upward into the canopy. The trees here were mostly white pine and hemlock, old growth that the camp owners had promised to preserve when they'd bought the property back in the 70s. 40, 50 feet tall, some of them. My light found the broken branches almost immediately. They'd been sheared off in a descending line, starting maybe 15 feet up and coming down at an angle, like something had fallen, or climbed down, using them as handholds. The breaks were fresh, the exposed wood pale and weeping sap. But the lowest broken branch was still a good 12 feet off the ground. Whatever had come down had dropped the final distance. I moved my light across the area where I'd heard the impact. The leaf litter looked disturbed, compressed, but in the darkness and with my hands trembling I couldn't make out any clear prints. Just an impression of displacement, of weight having been there and then leaving. That's when I made the decision I've questioned every day since. I fired the flare, the gun kicked in my hand, and the projectile arced up and out, trailing red sparks before igniting into brilliant magnesium white 30 feet above the tree line. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, the entire section of forest lit up like noon. Every shadow banished, every detail rendered in stark clarity. In that frozen moment, I saw it. Just the outline, the suggestion of something. Massive shoulders, perhaps 8 feet off the ground, caught in profile between 2 hemlocks about 50 yards upslope. The shape was wrong for a bear standing upright, too broad across the back, the proportions somehow off in a way my brain couldn't quite parse in that brief flash of light. Then the flare began its descent, the light dimming, and the shape was gone. Whether it had moved or simply merged back into shadow, I couldn't say. The flare hit the ground and sputtered out, leaving me in darkness that felt heavier than before. I didn't continue my rounds that night. I walked back to the staff cabin I shared with 2 other counselors, both asleep, and sat on my bunk until dawn, flashlight across my knees, watching the window. The droppings appeared the next morning. I found the first pile near the shower house, maybe 30 yards from where the main group of guest cabins sat empty. The camp didn't open for another week. We were there for setup and training, just 15 staff members scattered across a property that would soon hold 60 paying visitors. The droppings were substantial, roughly the diameter of my fist, dark and studded with what looked like undigested blackberry seeds. When I crouched down to examine them, the smell hit me. Oddly sweet, almost fermented, with an underlying musk that made my sinuses ache. I'd grown up in Vermont. I knew bear scat. This was similar but not quite right. Too sweet. Too much unprocessed plant matter, and the placement felt deliberate, deposited in the open just off the main path, where anyone walking between buildings would see it. I found 2 more piles that day, one near the mess hall, one directly in front of the storage shed where we kept the climbing equipment. The camp director, a former Marine named Kowalski with 30 years of wilderness experience, examined the droppings with me after breakfast. He prodded one with a stick, his weathered face unreadable. "Black bear," he said finally. "Big one, probably a male. They're gorging on berries this time of year, putting on weight for winter. Sometimes they don't digest them well." "What about last night?" I asked. "The branches?" He glanced up at the tree line. "Wind, probably. We had some gusts around midnight." There had been no wind. The air had been perfectly still, heavy with that pre-storm pressure that never quite broke. But I didn't argue. Kowalski had a way of deciding things, of reducing the uncertain to the known, and I was just a 23-year-old college graduate taking a summer job before grad school applications came due. What did I know about the woods compared to him? That afternoon, I asked one of the other counselors, a woman named Jen who'd worked here for 3 seasons, about the local wildlife. We were organizing life jackets in the boathouse, the lake lapping gently against the dock pilings beneath our feet. "Do the bears here climb?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She paused, an orange vest hanging from her hands. "Not really. I mean, cubs do, but the adults are too heavy. Black bears can climb, technically, but the ones in this area?" She shook her head. "Too big, too old. They mostly stick to the ground." "Have you ever seen anything else? Anything unusual?" The look she gave me was sharp, suddenly alert. "Why?" I told her about the previous night, editing nothing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the tree line visible through the open boathouse doors. "First summer?" she finally asked. "Yeah. The woods play tricks out here, especially at night. Sounds carry weird. Shadows look like things they're not." She went back to organizing the vests. "My first year, I was convinced I saw someone standing in the lake at 3 in the morning. Watched them for 20 minutes. Turned out it was a dead tree stump that I'd seen 100 times during the day but didn't recognize in the dark. It was a reasonable explanation, a kind explanation, but she wouldn't meet my eyes for the rest of the afternoon. The nightly rounds became an ordeal. Kowalski kept me on the 1 a.m. shift despite my request to switch. Said it was good for me to face down my nerves, build confidence. So every night I walked the same circuit. Main lodge to guest cabins to shower house to waterfront and back, approximately 30 minutes if I kept a steady pace. The flare gun stayed on my hip, heavy and reassuring. Nothing happened the second night, or the third, but I felt watched. That primitive hindbrain certainty that something's gaze is upon you, cataloging your movements, learning your patterns. I found myself walking faster, taking irregular routes, doubling back without reason. My sleep suffered. I'd lie in my bunk during the day. We rotated shifts and stare at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the underbrush outside. On the 4th night, I found the handprint. It was pressed into the mud beside the water pump behind the mess hall, illuminated in the beam of my flashlight like an accusation. 5 fingers, a broad palm, easily twice the size of my own hand, which I held up next to it for comparison, my breath coming short and fast. The fingers were too long, too thick, the thumb positioned at an angle that didn't quite match human anatomy. But the overall shape was unmistakable. A hand. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, flashlight trained on that print, my mind trying and failing to rationalize it. A bear paw could look almost hand-like, the toes spreading in mud. Maybe it was distorted, compressed, made to look larger by the way the mud had settled. Maybe a branch cracked somewhere behind the mess hall. I spun, flashlight cutting wild arcs through the darkness. The beam found nothing but trees and shadow, but I heard it now. Breathing. Deep, rhythmic, with a slight, wet rattle on the exhale. Coming from uphill, perhaps 40 feet away, blocked from view by the bulk of the mess hall building. Hello? My voice came out smaller than I'd intended. The breathing stopped. I waited. Flashlight steady now, trained on the corner of the building where whatever it was would have to emerge if it wanted to reach me. My other hand found the flare gun. I didn't draw it. Not yet. 30 seconds of silence. A minute. My heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, from the opposite direction, from between me and the lake, a low rumbling vocalization. Not a growl. Not quite a groan. Something in between, resonating at a frequency I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then cut off abruptly. I ran. Not walking fast, not jogging. Full sprint back to the staff cabin, flashlight forgotten, flare gun banging against my hip, my breath ragged with fear and exertion. I burst through the door hard enough to wake both my roommates, who found me standing in the middle of the room, chest heaving, unable to adequately explain what I'd heard. Kowalski was less sympathetic the next morning. "You abandoned your rounds," he said, his voice flat with disappointment. We were in his office, a cramped space in the main lodge that smelled of coffee and old paper. "You left the property unsecured for 40 minutes. Something was out there. A bear, maybe a moose. You said yourself you didn't see anything." You heard animal sounds in the woods at night." He leaned back in his chair. "Look, I get it. You're young. You're not used to being out here alone in the dark. But part of this job is keeping your head, not panicking, setting an example." I wanted to tell him about the handprint, but I'd gone back at dawn to photograph it and the print was gone, erased by rain I hadn't heard fall, the ground uniformly smooth as if nothing had ever been there. "I want you to take tonight off," Kowalski continued. "Get some real sleep. Tomorrow we'll start you on afternoon rounds instead. How's that sound?" It sounded like mercy. I accepted it, feeling both grateful and ashamed. The guests arrived that weekend, 20 adults, checking in for the camp's adult adventure retreat, a week of hiking, rock climbing, kayaking, and rustic accommodations designed to help urbanites reconnect with nature. They filled the property with noise and laughter, and their presence transformed the place. The woods suddenly felt smaller, domesticated, the shadows less oppressive. I started to sleep better. Started to wonder if Jen had been right, if the isolation had simply gotten to me those first few nights. I worked days now, leading morning hikes and assisting with the climbing wall. The nightly rounds fell to other counselors, and I didn't ask them if they'd experienced anything unusual. Didn't want to know. Didn't want to seem unstable. But on the third night of the retreat, one of the guests approached me after dinner. He was older, maybe 60, with the lean build of someone who spent serious time in the backcountry. I'd noticed him on the hikes. Always at the back of the group, always watching the tree line with an intensity that seemed excessive even for someone who loved nature. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said quietly, catching me alone by the equipment shed. I felt my stomach drop. "Seen what?" "Whatever's in these woods. Whatever's been here longer than the camp, longer than the trails, longer than the trees, maybe." His eyes were steady on mine. "I've been coming to the Adirondacks for 40 years. Some places are empty. Some places just have wildlife. But some places..." He paused. "Some places have something else. Something that tolerates us when it chooses to, but never forgets we're intruders." "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're smart to lie. Smarter still if you believe that lie. But I saw you that first night I arrived. Watched you walk the grounds during dinner. You moved like someone expecting ambush, like prey. He left before I could respond, disappearing into the growing darkness between the cabins. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lay in my bunk listening to my roommate's breathing, watching the window. Around midnight, I gave up and went outside, drawn by something I couldn't name toward the tree line where I'd first heard the branches break. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows, bright enough to see the path clearly. I walked without a flashlight, my feet finding the way by memory, until I reached the spot where everything had started. The branches I'd seen broken were healed now, or gone. I couldn't tell which in the silver light. But as I stood there, breathing in the night air, I felt it again. That sense of being observed, of something vast and patient taking stock of my presence. I looked up into the canopy. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw it. A shape among the branches. Massive, impossibly high, watching me with eyes that caught the moonlight like an animal's, but positioned like a human's. Then I blinked, and there was nothing. Just branches and sky, and the eternal whisper of wind through pine needles. I stood there for a long time, my neck craned back, my heart surprisingly calm. And I understood, with the clarity that comes in the small hours, that I would never know for certain what I'd seen, never be able to prove it, never be able to separate genuine experience from the tricks of exhaustion and isolation and fear. But I also understood that it didn't matter, because whether the thing in the trees was real or born from the dark spaces in my own mind, it had changed me, had shown me that the world contains more than our certainty can hold, that the boundaries between known and unknown are more porous than we pretend, that some questions aren't meant to be answered, only lived with. I walked back to my cabin, went to sleep, woke up the next morning and led a group of guests on a nature hike, pointing out birds and explaining trail markers and playing the part of someone who understood the woods. But I'd already decided. When the summer ended, I wouldn't return. Not because I was afraid, but because next time, I knew. I'd bring a thermal camera. I'd bring equipment. I'd bring the means to prove what I'd seen. And some part of me, the part that still woke at 1 a.m. listening, knew with cold certainty that the thing in the trees understood this too. That it was waiting to see if I'd make that mistake. Waiting to see if I'd cross from observer to pursuer. Waiting to teach me what happens to those who demand proof of things that prefer to remain unproven. I never went back to the Adirondacks. I tell people it's because I got into grad school early, started a new career track, moved on with my life. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment in the city, I wake to the sound of breathing in the darkness, deep and rhythmic, with that slight wet rattle on the exhale. And I lie very still, staring at the ceiling, knowing with perfect certainty that it's just the radiator, just my imagination, just the echoes of a summer I've convinced myself I misunderstood. Knowing this, and yet unable to fully believe it, unable to shake the feeling that some things, once you've drawn their attention, never quite let you go.